Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I declare open this hearing of the COVID-19 Select Committee. As set out in the circulated program, the committee will hear evidence today from the Department of the Treasury, the ATO, the Department of Social Services, the National Disability Insurance Agency and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. Information on the procedural rules governing public hearings and claims of public interest immunity have been provided to departments and agencies and is available from the Secretariat. An officer called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear, and witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. Mobile phones should be switched off or turned to silent. Colleagues, I would just flag that on the program it has us going till 12:15. Just in light of the long morning session, I am proposing that we finish with Treasury at 12:10 and just have a short 5-minute break before ATO appears. So just for information. I now welcome officers of the Department of the Treasury. Would the Department like to make an opening statement? No? Thank you. Okay, well, we'll go straight to questions and I'll do the usual 15-minute blocks rotating through committee members, starting with myself. Can I just ask to begin with, do you have a monthly figure of the fiscal support being provided through the whole range of measures that the government's... Mr. Welcome. Is that a question for... No, it's a question
Okay. No, that's all right. It's just pleased that Luke's arrived in time.
Yes.
A monthly figure?
Yeah, like how much in the combined measures of the programs are being provided to support the economy?
So I don't have a breakdown by month of the spend. I can tell you how much the total amount of support has been provided over the course of the period since the beginning of the pandemic, which is a bit over $100 billion has gone out in direct support measures.
That's money that's expended to date?
That's correct.
Okay. Out of the total, in terms of, we're talking here in terms of just the fiscal support, the sort of budget impact support?
The direct spending measures, that's right. So that's $100 billion has gone out. The total amount of economic support in terms of spending is $179 billion that's been committed.
179?
That's right.
And you're not tracking that monthly?
So I can take on notice whether we can provide a monthly breakdown, but I don't have a monthly breakdown here. No.
Are you monitoring measures by month, like, for example, JobKeeper, JobSeeker? Would you be tracking the big programs?
So we're certainly monitoring, we've certainly got JobKeeper by month, yes.
Yep.
On JobSeeker, spending on the coronavirus supplement, I think is probably available by month. I have the total spending to date, but I don't have a monthly breakdown of that.
Okay. Okay, well, perhaps if we start with the spending to date on that, on the coronavirus supplement and the JobKeeper, just to give me the latest figures.
Yep. So as of the 11th of September, $12.3 billion has been spent on the coronavirus supplement.
Yep.
And as of the 14th of September, $54.79 billion has been spent, has been paid out in JobKeeper payments.
47.9.
54.79.
54.79.
Yeah.
On JobKeeper.
Yep.
And I don't think you can't just do a divide by 6, can you? Because the numbers have been fluctuating.
That's right. The numbers vary, exactly. The numbers have varied month by month. That's right.
Okay. Well, if you could see what the monthly figure would be, I'm particularly interested in trying to understand what the reduction is going to be, the figure between what you're paying in coronavirus supplement in up till the end of September and then what you're expecting to spend on it in October, for example, once the first reduction comes in. Have you got an understanding of that?
I don't think that I do have in my briefing a breakdown of what the payments under the coronavirus supplement, how they're going to change between the September quarter and the December quarter. As you know, the payment rate is going from $550 down to $250.
Yep.
I can check whether any other colleagues have got that breakdown.
We don't sound here. I think, as Ms Wilkinson indicated, the aggregate number is a function of both the expected change in unemployment figures as well as the reduction in the rate. So in budget there will be an update to our economic forecasts around the labour market and unemployment, and so that will be a factor that feeds in to that calculation. But we don't have that. We haven't done that calculation here,
No.
to my knowledge.
You haven't done it, or you don't have it?
Well, we would have access to it, but
Yeah.
we'll need to. We don't have it in front of us here. It's not something in terms of that time period you've described. We haven't looked at it that way.
Okay. But I think wouldn't having an understanding of, in terms of the money going in to support the economy at the moment, that's obviously going to reduce in September. Wouldn't that be a pretty important figure from Treasury's point of view to have?
So to be clear, Senator, sorry, I may have misspoke. To be clear, we have looked closely in combination across the different parts of Treasury at the aggregate effect of all of the measures that are currently in place and the tapering that's been announced by government and what impact that will have on the budget, and that will be taken into account in the forecast, the updated forecast that we present in the budget.
So what can you tell the committee now about that? I mean, these are announcements that have been made in the end of July. So it's not a state secret that the money's being reduced. What you're saying, you do have an understanding on the aggregate effect of the tapering of those payments. What can you tell the committee about that? What will be the effect? Both on the budget, but also on the economy.
So in the July economic update, the July economic update included the estimates of the impact of the coronavirus supplement, the extension to that program till the end of December. So those numbers, both the economic forecasts in the statement and also the budget numbers in the statement, included the impact of extending the coronavirus supplement to the end of December. So in the July update, the estimates of the total spend on the coronavirus supplement in the 2021 year were published. So that's $11.58 billion. So all of those figures, I guess, were already included in the July update. But I guess what we don't have with us is the specific question that I think you're asking, which is what's the month-by-month profile of that spending? And the way in which we would do the macroeconomic forecasts, and Mr Yeaman like to correct me, but the macroeconomic forecasts are not done on a month-by-month basis.
No.
So those estimates incorporated the impact of the changes in policy, both the extension to JobKeeper and the extension to JobSeeker as announced in the June statement.
Yeah, I understand it. Yeah. I guess the point, and there's been quite a lot of research that's come out between July and today, recently, around from researchers and economists about the economic impact of the tapering or the cutting of those payments. And I guess my question to Treasury is, well, are you aware of that research? I think there's been quite a bit done and released even in the last week. But what is your response to that? What is your understanding of the economic impact of of reducing both the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker payments at the moment?
So, Senator, we are certainly aware of the research, and there's, as you say, many people out there having a look at these issues across a wide range of topics. I think it is the case that if in isolation, if you look at the reduction in the rate of JobSeeker, for example, and the tapering that you expect to see there, clearly in and of itself, that will take some income out of the economy. That is undisputed. there are a range of factors that are at play here in terms of how we look at the aggregate overall economic outlook, and the government obviously has to balance a range of factors in making its policy decisions based on our advice. One of the points I would make is that we have seen across large parts of the country, and Victoria is the clear exception and the standout, obviously, at the moment, given what they're experiencing in terms of their second wave. But we have seen across large parts of the country a continued upward trend and improvement in a number of the economic indicators across those countries, including in some parts of the labour market. So there has been a gradual economic improvement across the economy over recent months, and our general view, as outlined in the July update, is that that will continue in those states that are less heavily affected by COVID at a slower rate as the restrictions gradually ease, but continuing to recover in that way. There is also, I'd make the point, there has also been a very, very significant amount of policy support, even with the tapering that is envisaged. The policy support that is going into the economy now and over that period through to the middle of next year is extremely large by historical standards and also large by international standards. And one point I would make, Senator, is we've seen, in terms of discussing this issue of the if you like, what is often termed the fiscal cliff by others, we saw in the last national accounts where we saw obviously a very severe fall in GDP in the June quarter, but we also saw, for example, a very significant increase in the household savings rate to 20%, which is well above anything we've experienced in the last sort of decade, and going back to the, I think the 70s and 80s rates when there were reasons why people saved at a higher rate. And so in some ways, the support that's been provided to date, both through JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and through business support measures as well, such as the cash flow boost, it has bolstered the balance sheets in aggregate. And I'm not here claiming by any means that all individuals are better off or worse off. But at the aggregate level across the economy, when we look at the national outlook, there has been a substantial amount of money that has gone onto those balance sheets, and that will allow, one, it's boosted confidence and allowed people to keep their business open and provided support for households. But that, we think, that will provide an ongoing level of support to households as they can then run down some of those accumulated savings that they've built up through the government support that's been injected. So we think that support that's been provided to date will continue to support the economy over a period of time, even if some of the measures begin to taper off.
Do you think many of those are job seeker? I saw the increase in household savings. Do you think, what's your understanding of the sort of more, detailed demographic that might sit behind that? Do you think they're job seeker recipients?
It is difficult in the data to get a clear read. I think there's different things that we've seen. So I think it's probably fair to say at the aggregate level that in the middle income categories, there's probably been slightly more savings behaviour than at the lower income, which you'd expect. But we have also seen that across the spectrum, I think, and I'd have to go back and look at the detailed data, but across the spectrum, we have seen, for example, people paying down their mortgages or getting ahead on their mortgages more quickly than they might otherwise have done, using the support that's been provided where they can to bolster that position, and super, for example. So I think it is difficult to get a clear read on the data on that point.
Okay. In one of the reports that was done by the ANU, they're saying that the reduction in JobSeeker and JobKeeper payments, whilst more generous than was offered before COVID-19, it says they estimate that the number of people in poverty will increase by 740,000 people compared to if the payments were maintained at the level that they were originally commenced at. Do you agree with that? Or if not, do you have an understanding of how many people would fall below the poverty line once these changes are made?
We don't, Senator. I think I've seen some media reports on that. I haven't seen the detailed analysis that sits behind that, and there are different definitions of how you describe poverty in this case and what the poverty line
this is using, I
looks
think,
like.
two measures of poverty. In fact, I think they're using the after-housing version of poverty.
I would, as you said, Senator, I would make the point that the reduction in JobSeeker, the tapering that's occurring, is still at a rate higher than the existing rate of unemployment benefits for this period, and we haven't done detailed analysis on.
Wouldn't that be part of your role though, like trying to, in terms of advising government, like if we taper at this point, this is going to be the result on the people that are recipients of JobKeeper? Wouldn't that be pretty fundamental information to provide government about what you expected to see to happen to the incomes of those who are relying on this income support?
So we've provided advice to government around how we see the fiscal measures interacting with the economic measures and the aggregates there. But we haven't. What I'm saying is we haven't done analysis around, the definition of poverty and where the poverty line sits and whether people will move above or below that line as a result of these changes.
So how do you explain to the government what the impact of cutting it by $300 would be? I mean, surely there's, if we cut it by $300 a fortnight, this is what we expect to see. Surely that's part of what has to go before government before they make their decision.
So there's a range of other advice that's provided, and certainly from our social services department and from our human services department, there has been and is other further advice being provided around the impact on individuals and those safety net aspects.
But the Treasury doesn't do that? So that's DSS, is it?
Well, our primary focus at this time has been around the aggregate effect on the economy and the aggregate effect on incomes across the economy. But we certainly do have a mind to the distributional. Mr Wilkinson may be able to add to this comment, but we certainly do have a look at the distributional impacts of the policies. But I'm just trying to be clear, we haven't looked at whether or not people. I mean, there was a long and lively debate, I suspect, before this, and I'm not as expert as others in this space, prior to the crisis around, as we know, the level of New Start at the time and support, and whether that was a livable wage or not. And so there's been an ongoing debate and discussion around the adequacy of government payments. And I guess I'm saying we haven't looked at it from an adequacy perspective here in the direct form. We've looked at it primarily from a macro perspective.
Surely adequacy, well, I imagine from Treasury's point of view, you want to make sure that there's enough money going out to support people to live,
Of course.
number one, but also to support demand across the economy.
So Mr Wilkinson may be able to assist here, because I think there certainly has been, in thinking about where these rates are set and the levels, there has been certainly an eye to adequacy.
You must have an understanding of what the consequential impact of it would be on low income earners on a reduction of $300 per fortnight at the moment.
So we certainly, clearly understand the number of people who are receiving the coronavirus supplement, what the impact is in terms of changing the rate of the coronavirus supplement on all of those people who are recipients, taking into account what...
So you do understand the impact?
Well, in terms of what the aggregate, we know the number of people who are receiving it.
So you know how much less you would be paying?
The total, what that total would be, which is reflected in the fiscal numbers, right? So that's clearly incorporated.
But I'm trying to understand what you understand about the impact once those cuts come in, what that's going to have on the people, over 2 million people who are recipients of the coronavirus supplement. And surely that's part of, ultimately, that feeds into what an appropriate reduction in that rate would have been.
So there's a couple of different ways of thinking about it. I mean, one of them is thinking about it from a macroeconomic impact. From a macroeconomic perspective, what's the sort of impact on the macroeconomy of having a different level of payments, particularly when we're thinking about those sorts of impacts. I think as Mr Yam has outlined, what you're thinking about is with any government spending, you're thinking about what the multiplier impacts of those are. And you know that payments to lower income individuals typically have a higher multiplier because people who are more income constrained will tend to spend more of the payments that they receive. So that's absolutely taken into account. In terms of the broader question about what should be the level of payments to individuals across the welfare system, there's a broader discussion around adequacy, around all of those things. But I guess I'm not sure what so we can quantify what the impact is on the recipients.
Well, there's been a range of research, for example, that says, people, 750,000 people are going to be moved into poverty. There's other research that will say it will withdraw, withdrawing this amount of money will have this negative economic impact and will consequentially flow on to, the loss of, I think the figure I saw was about 145,000 jobs. I mean, That's what I'm trying to understand. We've got, you know, an economy in recession, we've got high unemployment, you know, the economy is in deep trouble, and yet we're choosing right now to reduce some of these fundamental supports that are going into, you know, keeping families together, but also supporting economic activity. And I'm trying to understand what Treasury's understanding of that is. Like,
so our primary focus, as Mr Yeaman's outlined, is the primary focus is really the latter part of the analysis you're talking about, which is what's the macroeconomic impact of changing these payment rates. So these payment rates were lifted at the beginning of the pandemic. They're retaining at levels which are well above the levels before the pandemic. When we're thinking about it, the primary way in which we think about what the macroeconomic impact of changing the payments is by thinking about what the flow-on impact through the economy would be of changing payments.
Okay, so can you tell me what that will be? Because people are saying that we will see job losses, we will see people move from JobKeeper to JobSeeker. What's Treasury's understanding of that? Like, what are the consequential macro impacts of these reductions, both for JobKeeper and JobSeeker? Will there be job losses? Will there be people moving between the payments?
So I think in evidence, so on the question of JobKeeper and JobSeeker recipients, in the evidence that I provided last time I was before the committee, we did point out that it's never been the case that you could get JobKeeper but you couldn't get JobSeeker. Access to JobSeeker is a function of your income, so depending on the level of income you receive. And as a consequence of the government introducing a two-tiered payment into the JobKeeper program, there will definitely be some additional people who will receive, so some people who were previously receiving $1,500 of JobKeeper who'll go to the lower payment rate, and who may, depending on what other income that they earn, be eligible, and the income of their partner and all of the other things, criteria which determine your eligibility, may also be eligible for JobSeeker. So there will definitely be an increase in the number of JobSeeker recipients. What the aggregate impact, I mean, in aggregate, we're expecting there to be less JobKeeper recipients in the JobKeeper program, partly because we're reapplying the turnover test, and the businesses that will be eligible for JobKeeper going forward are businesses that can demonstrate that they have actually faced a reduction in turnover in the September quarter or the December quarter, depending on which quarter you're talking about. And it's worth keeping in mind, a significant proportion of JobKeeper payments, particularly in the latter half of this first 6 months, have been wage subsidies to businesses. So they've been wage subsidies to businesses rather than, if you like, income support payments to individuals. So for the most part, I mean, we are expecting, and Victoria's an exception, but we're expecting that, and with the evidence is that many of the people who have been on JobKeeper have now been returned to the normal roles that they were playing beforehand. They were occupying beforehand. There's relatively few people on JobKeeper who we are expecting that are receiving JobKeeper as an income supplement. Most people on JobKeeper are receiving the income payment from JobKeeper plus whatever the supplement is to correlate with whatever their normal wage should be. So the shift that's going to take place is that there's going to be a shift for business balance sheets. So businesses are then going to have to be making decisions about what it is that they are going to do going forward. Does that make sense?
Yep. I guess just in response, because I've got to hand the call over, but overall, the reductions that we'll see at the end of September, in Treasury's view, will they have a negative impact on the economy?
So I think you've got to think about it in broad terms. As Mr Yeaman said, you've got to think about what's all of the support that's been provided to date over these 6 months, what's happened to the savings rate, how are businesses then going to be responding? I mean,
I understand
a reduction in that support, would lead to less economic activity if you look at just that factor. But then offsetting that, you've got to be thinking about what else is happening in terms of the broader recovery in the economy, the need for that ongoing support. And it's the net of all of those which determines what the outcome for the economy is. And I can't remember what the GEFU forecasts were in the September and December quarters, but the expectation was for a gradual recovery over that period, as I recall.
And that's where you are today? Like, that's what you think will happen?
Well, Victoria's, so as I think we've discussed before, the Victorian outbreak, his second wave, and the restrictions that have been put in place will certainly have an impact on the recovery through the September quarter. And I think the Treasurer has made comments along the lines that that quarter is more likely to be a broadly flat outcome or potentially a small negative outcome. We're still working through those numbers for budget. But we still see, outside of Victoria, as I said, the broad recovery progressing across the rest of the country and then through into the December quarter.
And so in terms of any reassessment of the cutting of these payments, that from Treasury's point of view, you don't see any reason to reassess in terms of Victoria and that view around the September quarter?
So I think that's a matter for government. We provide our advice to them in the context of the budget process. They're working through that now and it'll be announced in a few weeks' time.
Well, these payments are due to change, I think, in sort of 6 days or between 6 and 10 days, depending on JobSeeker or JobKeeper. I presume if the government had changed their mind, we would be aware of that now.
As I said, Senator, in terms of our view, we've provided our advice to government on those matters and the policy is as stated publicly.
Okay. Senator Davey.
Thank you. Just on the Victorian issue, I think last time you appeared before us, we had acknowledgement that prior to the second wave, Victoria had looked like it was rebounding amongst the strongest of all the states from the easing of restrictions. And we did ask at the time about due to the second wave, what that would mean for the next quarter figures, and that in the next data series we will suffer more. I guess I'm hearing that is now the expectation you're expecting for Victoria in particular, some quite significant downturn.
Certainly, Senator. I mean, the nature of the lockdowns in Victoria dictates that obviously large parts of the economy are shut down, and so that's going to have a major impact on the economic recovery overall. We think most of that is centred in Victoria. There are obviously some effects on the rest of the country in terms of confidence and some of the broader impacts through border closures as well. I think we provided a response to the committee on notice, which highlighted that the stage 3 restrictions initially put in place in Victoria we estimated would lower real GDP growth by 0.75 of a percentage point in the September quarter 2020. And then based on those additional restrictions that were announced by the Victorian Government on the 2nd and 3rd of August, stage 4 restrictions would lower real GDP growth by 1.75 percentage points, a further 1.75 percentage points in the September quarter, which took the total combined effect of those measures in September to 2.5 percentage points, which is in the order of around $10 to $12 billion. Given the extended nature of those restrictions now and the slower path out of restrictions, as I said, we would expect some of those effects to continue to flow through into the December quarter as well and hold back the recovery for a little longer. And as I said, in other parts of the country, they are affected to some extent by that, but broadly, in those areas that are relatively COVID-free, the recovery is progressing in those areas.
And last time you were here, I was specifically asking also about the impact of the border closures on cross-border economies. I referred you to a study that had been done by Regional Development Australia Murray, where the businesses estimated losses of up to $8,500 a week. Have you done any further work since then on border regions specifically and the economic impacts in border regions as opposed to across the whole state?
Thank you, Senator. We haven't done a large-scale modelling exercise around any of this. We certainly looked at the material you provided, so thank you for that, and other material that's been put into the public domain. I think if I speak about border closures overall, I suppose when we look at it, our estimates are that there is around $300 billion of interstate trade in services in an average year under normal circumstances. which is a very large amount of activity, clearly. Now, if you think about both goods and services, I mean, overall, I think the border closures, in the main, freight has continued to operate across borders quite well. There probably are some productivity effects, I think, that have affected the operation of that freight and maybe have increased costs to some extent. Some of the liaison information that we've received from logistics companies and others suggests that it could be in the order of 2 to 3% additional costs associated with some of those border closures and the extra administrative burden that's attached to that. If you think about, but in the main, we think that the interstate trade in goods is probably proceeding relatively well. Services is where we're probably most affected, particularly through the tourism sector. And as I said, that accounts for about $300 billion of activity in a normal year. But much of that services trade is digital, and it's through services and other things that have probably been able to continue to operate. So it's probably primarily focused around this is at the national level, and I'll come to your question. So it's really probably in the tourism sector in particular that we're most heavily affected. And we have some statistics, again, from the Tourism Research Australia body that says that total domestic interstate tourism spending, again, amounts to around $45 billion a year. So to the extent that activity is obviously unable to proceed while borders are closed, that is an aggregate amount that is perhaps at risk, I suppose, is the way I would put it. Clearly, we're not in normal times, and if you were to take away the border restrictions tomorrow, I wouldn't expect to go back to that level of activity, obviously, straight away. And some of that spending is obviously diverted to other goods as well, and household spending and other forms of spending. But that gives some indication of the size. So there are very significant numbers, I suppose, is the way I would put it, at play in the interstate trade in services. In terms of cross-border communities themselves, it is difficult to get a sense of the direct impact economically, community by community. We've seen some of the numbers you referred to. By our estimates, there are around 100,000 Australians who work across state and territory borders, if you exclude the ACT and New South Wales. And around 40,000 people normally work across the borders in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And we certainly are aware of, well, we haven't done aggregate numbers and modelling on this. We certainly are aware that there have been difficulties for those communities, local difficulties for those communities. The Regional Development Australia body did some analysis that found that as of the 24th of July, approximately 5% of the New South Wales-Victoria border workforce were unable to work because they live or work outside of the designated border zone. And the survey also found that 89% of businesses surveyed in New South Wales and Victoria border communities had been impacted by the border closure, which was forcing them to reduce staff as well. And we're also aware of some localised challenges around childcare, specialist skills, and medical personnel as well. So it is clear that the border closures are having an impact on those affected communities. We haven't got an aggregate number, community by community, for that, Senator.
Further to that, you mentioned the freight code and it is clearly working well. There are other industries, however, that are impacted by border closures that don't have a nationally consistent code, and I think I've been banging on about it for quite some time. But specifically agriculture, to the point where there was an editorial in The Australian just this week raising concerns about the impact of the failure to be able to access, contract services for agriculture will have an impact on the supply chain, which will then impact on food prices and access to produce and services. Have we done any work on that flow-on impact so it's not just the impact on people's livelihoods, but there is a flow-on impact on the broader economy through the inability to get some consistency of access to those sorts of services?
So, Senator, as I said, at the aggregate level overall, I think, as you say, the freight task across Australia and supply chains broadly, we think, are operating relatively well, given the circumstances that we face. We are certainly aware through some of our business liaison that we do, and some of the reporting that you've mentioned, that there are sectors, particularly in agriculture, but also in one or two others, where there are actually hard restrictions that are preventing certain goods from getting to market in a timely fashion. That will carry a cost. We don't have we don't have analysis of what the flow-on effects, detailed flow-on effects of that are. I think in the broad, at the national aggregate level, I think those numbers would not be as significant as some of the other factors that we're facing in this current crisis. But certainly for the businesses that are affected and for the local communities that are affected, that would be a very significant impact.
And we've recently seen Premier Andrews' roadmap out for Victoria. Some would say it's a longer route than some would prefer. Have Treasury done any work on what we've now seen announced and how that's going to look for particularly the Victorian economy, but also our economy more broadly?
I'd come back to my earlier answer. The kind of figures that the figures I mentioned earlier, which give an indication that's sort of $10 to $12 billion over the September quarter, that gives an indication of the economic cost while we remain in these hard restrictions. We had, at the July update, expected a gradual stepping out through Victoria. That has been slowed down, and certainly the roadmap that was announced is a more gradual, stepped approach to what we had in the July economic update. So certainly that will mean that some of those impacts that I described earlier will carry forward, as I said, into the December quarter as well. In the budget we'll provide, we're still working through sort of detailed analysis around that, and the budget will provide more detail, I suspect, around that issue. But it is definitely the case that relative to our July update, the path of exit from the restrictions is somewhat slower than it was otherwise.
Going back to JobKeeper and the provisions we put in place to try and support people and keep them in a relationship with their employers, and part of that was also freeing up the IR regime to enable employers and employees to negotiate their conditions a bit better. We know the Prime Minister has put IR reform on top of the agenda for the National Cabinet as part of the process to help us in our sort of get the economy flowing again. How important or what would you say about the need to keep those emergency provisions that have been put in place going on into the future to keep those employee-employer relationships going? And then also, can you comment on what impact broader IR reform would have to help our economic recovery?
So I might just start. So you're right that the JobKeeper direction was an important element of the initial JobKeeper program when it was announced, and certainly a lot of the feedback that we received through the Business Liaison Unit was that those flexibility provisions were welcomed by business and made a big difference to enabling businesses and their employees to negotiate more flexibly about how to operate in this very unusual circumstance we found ourselves in. In announcing the extension to JobKeeper, the government has announced extensions to those JobKeeper directions. There are some changes to those, which, if you want to talk about the details, I suggest that you get the Department of Attorney Generals to walk you through how those have changed. And that was in recognition of, again, the fact that as well as providing ongoing support through JobKeeper, the government just recognises that we are in very challenging economic times, and having more flexibility to manage the relationship between businesses and employers and employees is important. So it's certainly been recognised that that's important, and that was why there was a lot of work put into the government agreeing an extension of those arrangements. More broadly, the government has announced that there's a series of discussions that are taking place on IR matters, ranging from casuals through to greenfield arrangements and a number of different things. Again, I would suggest that if you want to talk about the detail, it'd be good to talk to the Department of Attorney Generals. Any of those flexibilities, when we're thinking about about having a flexible and adaptable economy that is probably going to have to adjust to some pretty significant structural changes, or whether or not this is going to lead to structural changes, it does feel like the pandemic is likely to lead to an acceleration of a range of structural changes which were already in train, and making sure that we've got an IR system which provides both the right level of support to employees, but also the right level of flexibility in the relationship between employers and employees is critically important to ensuring that we have a well-functioning economy, taking up opportunities when they arise, and enabling the labour market to work as flexibly and as effectively as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Wilkinson. Thank you, Senator Davey. Senator McKim. Do we have you, Senator McKim? Yep, we do. Can we hear you? That's the question.
My apologies, Chair. Can you hear me now?
I can, yep.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to start with a couple of questions on the June national accounts. They showed an increase in household disposable income, thanks mostly to government assistance. Yet that was accompanied by record drops in household consumption and record increases in household savings. Now, obviously, the pandemic response was a major factor here, but I wanted to ask whether you've analysed who, in terms of their income, got more money, who saved it and who spent it. And I guess another way of asking that question is, were low-income earners more inclined to spend or save than usual? Were middle-income earners more inclined to spend or save than usual? And same question for high-income earners.
Senator Trevor Powell from the Macroeconomic Conditions Division. We discussed this briefly a little bit earlier. We've looked at the aggregate savings rate across all households, and as we discussed, that rose very significantly to 19.8%. We haven't, at this point, broken that down across, for example, income groups. Apart from, I think, probably just the general proposition that we would expect necessarily that probably those at the lower income end of the spectrum, you'd expect would have spent more of the income received than perhaps those at the higher end.
Yeah, is that work that you would intend to do, to break that down by income?
It's not something that we have got on our schedule to do at the moment. It's certainly something we could do. Perhaps the ABS also might be able to provide some information on this, so we're very happy to talk to the ABS about that.
Senator, if I could add one point.
Thanks. If you're able.
Sorry, Senator, if I may just add one point to that as well. There has been survey work done by the ABS and others as well, looking at the impact of these policy measures, and it certainly is the case that we see, particularly at the lower end, those payments at the lower end of the income spectrum, our view is that they are largely being spent, and that is supporting the economy.
Yeah, you'd certainly expect that to be the case. I wanted to look, obviously, I think everyone accepts that the June national accounts were a snapshot of highly unusual circumstances, but there were very similar things that happened in the second half of last year, obviously pre the pandemic hitting. So in the September quarter last year, we had a doubling of the tax offset for low and middle income earners. So that resulted in the highest quarterly growth in household disposable income in a decade. Yet household consumption grew at the lowest rate in a decade, and household savings increased. So why did people back then, pre-pandemic, choose to, in effect, save a tax cut rather than spend it?
It's always difficult, Senator, to know exactly why households as a group do particular things. We do know, we have looked briefly at that quarter. From memory, there was a number of things going on, particularly we were on a down part of the housing cycle, really in that period. And so we've also looked in the subsequent quarters, and so we think there was obviously some spreading of that income out over multiple quarters. But certainly, I think, as you say, in the case in that particular quarter, consumption was probably a bit weaker than we had expected, but the subsequent quarters, I think that supported spending, particularly through the December quarter.
Yeah, and I think that is, Senator, sorry to jump in. I think that is an important point around when we think about the impact of these policy measures in our macroeconomic modelling. The way the multipliers work for us is that there is a sort of initial boost to incomes. Some of that is spent in the first quarter, but it then is then spread out and spent over a number of quarters after that, depending. And if there are other factors, as Mr. Power said, in the economic environment that are causing uncertainty or a bit of caution, that means that some of those delays and lags can be longer than otherwise.
Yeah, but house prices grew strongly in the second half of last year. So if you're relying on a wealth effect argument, wouldn't the wealth effect have had a positive effect on consumption?
Well, I guess I'm just sort of saying that compared to sort of the longer housing cycle we'd had, that if you like was changing, and certainly it had over the latter half of the year and the early part of this year. But I guess, as we'd sort of said, it's always very difficult to know exactly what has particularly happened in a quarter and why. But we do know, as we do expect now, that to the extent there is building up of household savings or household disposable income, we do know over a long period that feeds into consumption and then supports activity in following periods. Exactly when that occurs is always a tricky thing to forecast, but we're quite confident in that over any sort of medium period.
What do you mean by medium period? And I guess the reason I ask that question is, I accept that there's some volatility, from one quarter to the next, but the average growth in consumption across the September and December quarters for 2019 was as low as any 6-month period for a decade, save for the June to September 6-month period. In other words, December didn't make up for September last year, did it?
Well, without sort of having all that information in front of me, Senator, I think that what we've seen so far is some of the spending that we've seen in the real-time data, which has happened, if you like, post-June, so in the period when we'd started to see a recovery. We think that a lot of the stimulus support that has been provided into households has really supported consumption, particularly outside of Victoria at the moment. We know Victoria is lagging a little, but certainly we'd seen a very strong bounce in consumption in the early periods of the recovery. So I think, we're quite confident that we see that occurring. That is now moderated, particularly in Victoria, as I'd said. But we've seen quite a quick response, I think, in the recent period. And so I think we feel quite confident in that as a transmission channel as a result of the payments that have been occurring.
All right. Thank you. I guess what I'm driving at here is that last year, low and middle income earners got a tax cut, and yet they chose to save more and spend less, and fair enough too. But if low and middle income earners save more and spent less when they got a tax cut, is there any reason to think that high income earners, who are going to be by far the biggest beneficiaries of future tax cuts, won't do the same?
Well, Senator, I think the way I'd answer that, Senator, is as we've discussed in the committee before, as a general proposition, we would say that, as is sort of well accepted in the economic circles, that payments to income-constrained households and income-constrained businesses, on average, have a greater propensity to be spent than to less cash-constrained businesses. And I think that is the case. Now, in any given quarter and at any given period, it's very difficult to know what the counterfactual would be in terms of the level of spending and what other factors are playing into that. But we would say that is generally the case. But as we've discussed previously, and again, without preempting any government announcements and policies in this space, there are a range of reasons why you might pursue a policy such as tax cuts as opposed to income support for households or business investment incentives, for example, that go beyond just purely the stimulatory effect.
Well, thank you. But isn't it the case that, the upcoming tax cuts, no matter when they end up coming into play, are going to lead to more wealth accumulation and less trickling down to everyone else than the previous tax cuts. I mean, the super wealthy are going to make off like bandits here, and the economic stimulus is going to be less than if more tax cuts were given to lower income people, or things like JobSeeker were retained at the current rate.
Well, as I said, Senator, I think there are a range of reasons why the government has put in place the tax reform package that it has, and they go to a range of factors, including the interactions in the tax system between the company tax rate and the income tax rate, between incentives for work, etc. So there are a range of factors there that play into that space. As I said, our analysis would suggest that from a purely stimulatory perspective, that payments to lower and middle income households have a higher propensity to be spent than payments to higher income households, but there are a range of factors why government may choose to take measures in the tax space outside of that.
All right, thank you. Have you modelled for the government the effect on consumption of bringing forward the timing of the next round of income tax cuts?
We have modelled and provided analysis and briefing and advice to the government on the economic impacts of a whole series of measures, including around payments, around tax system and around business incentives as well.
And that includes modelling the effect on consumption of bringing forward the timing of future tax cuts?
Well, it's certainly both the timing and the impact, the broad economic impact of those measures. We have looked at all of that as part of providing advice to government.
Okay, thank you. And what dates have you used for that modelling? In other words, what dates have you used as the basis? What commencement dates for future tax cuts have you used for the basis of that modelling?
Senator, we've looked at a range of modelling options across a series of measures, and that all forms part of our detailed advice to government as part of the budget process in the normal way. I'm not in a position to be able to talk to the specific scenarios that have been tested in that space.
Well, have you modelled? Well, let me ask it this way then. What is the earliest date that you have used as the basis for that modelling and the subsequent advice to government?
I'd have to take it on notice, Senator. I'm not, as I said, we have, as you would expect us to do, we have provided a whole series of advice over a period of time to government around the different options that are possible in this space, and as I said, covering the full suite of measures and various timing options. I would need to take that on notice, Senator, and see what I can provide to you.
So you're not aware of the dates that you've used for the basis, as the basis of that modelling?
Not that I can speak to here, Senator, no. I'd need to go and have a look at that, Senator.
All right. Why would bringing forward tax cuts for super wealthy people in the middle of a recession be a good idea?
I'll ask one of my colleagues from our revenue group to join me, Senator. I think as we've discussed before, we would still say, and as I said earlier, to the extent that in relative terms from a purely stimulatory perspective, payments to low-income households would provide a relatively larger fiscal multiplier, if I can put it that way, than broader forms of tax cuts at the middle and upper end of the spectrum. We certainly think that any form of tax relief across the various income tax scales would still provide a stimulatory effect through the economy. And the government has, and I might ask my colleague to speak more to this, but the government has announced those tax reform measures as part of a broader suite of measures to reform the tax system, and I might just ask my colleague to add to that.
Thank you. Katrina DeMarco, Division Head, Tax Analysis Division. I think as Mr Yeaman's rightly described, there's kind of a variety of reasons why you look at policies in this space over this period. And he's already spoken to the kind of the aspects that they look at with respect to the stimulatory side. The income tax plan that was announced in 1819 and then built on in 1920 largely reflected a look at structural changes to this tax system. I think as Mr Yeaman's already alluded to, there's two key pieces to that. The first piece of it is around more closely aligning the middle tax rate of the personal tax system with corporate tax rates, and also improving incentives around return to effort and to work. One of the key challenges in the Australian tax system is obviously we don't have index tax scales, and so what you see as incomes rise is you get, we often talk about bracket creep, is that average tax rates rise as well. So in the absence of some kind of tax cuts to provide tax relief, you'll see ever rising average income tax rates across the income spectrum.
Senator McKim, you have a final question, and then I'll need to hand the call to Senator Lambie.
All right, thanks, Chair. And I'll come to company profits in my next bracket of questions. But my final question for this bracket is whether Treasury has adjusted the modelling that you've just said that you are doing for government, the modelling of the upcoming tax cuts on consumption and demand, given what we saw with the effect on consumption and demand of the low and middle income tax offsets.
So we take all of that historical experience into account when we provide our advice around the impact of these measures. So we're constantly looking at, especially at the moment, we're constantly looking at our fiscal multipliers and how we think they will play out, and we take account of those historical experiences. Most of our models are based on historical experience, so we do take account of that. Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Senator McKim.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Lambie, can I go to you? Just see if you've got...
Thank you, Chair.
Good.
I just have to... Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah?
we can.
So I have some small business that are having problems with the cash flow boost and JobKeeper, especially for the new small businesses that are starting up. And I know the country is trying to encourage startups, but there seems to be a little bit of a problem. So I'm just wondering if you guys might be able to help me out so I can get back to these small businesses. We've heard from them, there was a bloke, a small business owner in Melbourne who was missing out on $30,000 from cash flow boost because he set up his business in the beginning of this year and hasn't been able to put in his first quarterly business activity statement before the 12th of March, which seems to be a problem. And when he spoke to the ATO about their decision not to provide the funding, they admitted that he would have qualified for payments if he had chosen to set up his business to report monthly. He was doing the wrong thing, but he missed out just because he couldn't do, because he had decided to do his paperwork quarterly instead of monthly. And other small businesses are facing similar problems with access to the JobKeeper. Many are missing out on significant sums of money. Do you know whether that problem's been rectified now, or if you're not doing it monthly and you're doing it quarterly, you're still not getting paid if you didn't put it in before the 12th of March? Does anyone fix this issue?
So I'll get Mr Thompson to talk specifically about cash flow boost. In general, I think we've talked about this before at the committee. There were a range of decisions that the government made around access to all of these programs, cash flow boost and JobKeeper, in order to ensure the integrity of the program. So it was really important to have clear dates which were in history to establish, when a business was in place and what a business had to have demonstrated to demonstrate that they were a genuine business in order to ensure the integrity of the program. And it's not, and I'm not suggesting that the person that you're talking about is not a business with integrity. I'm just saying that when you're designing these sorts of programs, which are big programs that have to apply rapidly across the whole economy, right, there are some calls that the government has to make around integrity to avoid not people like the person you're talking about, but to avoid, charlatans and others who are absolutely alert to the possibility of setting up their business in a particular way in order to get a big payment from the government that they wouldn't otherwise be. I might just see whether Mr Thompson has anything specific to say about that cash flow boost issue.
I would like to just say this. Now, this has been a problem from the start. You guys have known this, and I really don't want the tap dancing. I mean, you've had the top accounting bodies pointing out these issues to Treasury back in April, then again in June. They suggested that the ATO Commissioner should have the power to establish alternative tests for businesses that don't qualify for stimulus payments because of paperwork issues. Did Treasury look at this as part of the JobKeeper review?
as part of the JobKeeper review, Treasury looked at the integrity of the program, and this wasn't a matter that was explored in depth in that program. No, I mean there was an analysis of what were all of the different integrity issues which were being addressed in the design of the program, and were they effective, and were there other concerns that we had about integrity. That was explored as part of the JobKeeper review, but I'm not aware of this specific question about monthly versus.
Okay, so the integrity's there. You've been offered an alternative here, and the alternative is why won't you let the new businesses prove that they qualify for payments by providing the ATO with bank statements or invoices? Is that not enough integrity?
So all I can say, Senator, is that these are challenging judgment calls for very large programs. The ATO, it is important, I think, from the government's perspective, and that these programs are managed with integrity. There is some flexibility in some elements of this program to provide the Commissioner discretion, but it's also the case that in order to manage the actual implementation of these programs in very short time frames, it was an unavoidable element of the design of the program.
I understand that. Sorry, no, I'm just saying, we know there's a fault with it. You've known there's been a fault with this for months. You've been told on numerous occasions by, some of the top accountants, all that sort of stuff. So what I'm asking you is, what is wrong with you? You're asking the integrity. I mean, I've got a problem with the banks. Don't worry about that. Their integrity. But what are you saying? Their bank statements, their business bank statements, invoices will not be enough. Is that what you're saying? That's what I want to know. Instead of their quarterly reports.
Go ahead.
Hector Thompson, Acting Division Head, Individuals in Indirect Tax Division. So that as Ms Wilkinson alluded to, there are some options available to the Commissioner, but I would stress they're very limited. The integrity rules around the provision of records prior to the 12th of March are a critical integrity element of the package. Otherwise, there would be significant risks around retrospective creation of either entities or transactions that would be very difficult to maintain the broader integrity around the program.
So has anyone provided advice to the Treasury about this issue? And is the lack of action on this problem a decision of the government or a decision of the department?
The design of the program is a decision for the government. So all aspects of the design of the program, all of the rules, all of the legislation which governs the program, that those are matters for the government.
Senator Lambie, do you have a final question?
One more, thank you, Chair. So why hasn't Treasury provided an official response to the letter in June?
I'll have to take that on notice, Senator Lambie. I'm not aware of the letter that you're talking about. Was this a letter in respect of the cash flow boost? Is that what, or what was the? Perhaps you could offline get back to us about exactly what that letter is, and we're very happy to have a look at it and come back to you and provide a response.
The accounting bodies that wrote you a letter, that would be the accounting bodies that wrote you a letter. They've had no reply. So could someone give a reply, please?
Okay, I think Ms Wilkinson has said that she will follow that up, Senator Lambie, and come back to you directly. Can I go to Senator Patrick now?
Thank you very much, Chair. Maybe I'll start with you, Ms Wilkinson, and you can deflect me to someone else, but you seem to be the go-to person. I just want to talk about JobKeeper and reports in the media that there are now numerous companies that have been in receipt of JobKeeper that are paying either increased dividends, or CEOs are still being paid bonuses. And I basically, the difficulty I have with this is that, of course, bonuses and dividends are linked to financial performance normally, as is JobKeeper. And I'm just wondering if you could give me a sort of broad outline as to, from a policy perspective, how Treasury is looking at this, because there's clearly a number, or lots of people in the community that find this to be somewhat offensive.
Sure. So Senator, I'm obviously aware of the media coverage of this issue and the discussion, including comments that Jennifer Westacott made on Insiders a couple of weeks ago. From a policy design perspective, as you're aware, and we've discussed this from the beginning of this committee, I mean, JobKeeper was it's a very large macroeconomic program that was designed to provide support to a large number of businesses across Australia as quickly as possible. It was designed to apply across a range of different businesses by size, by structure, by industry, and we had to design it to implement it as quickly as possible, but with integrity. And so one of the things that we did was we tried to draw upon, to whatever extent possible, existing definitions and existing ATO rules and processes in order to enable this program to be rolled out. There was a decision taken around when the program was established, which was that because of the nature of the pandemic and the significant hit to confidence from the pandemic, that it was important to provide businesses with a degree of confidence about the support they were going to get through the JobKeeper program over the course of the program. So once you established your eligibility at the outset of the program, you were then eligible through to the end of the first 6 months. Now, in order to be eligible for the next 2 quarters, you have to re-establish your eligibility by turnover. That does and did mean that there may be some businesses that were extremely significantly impacted in the first month or 2 of the program that have recovered, and there are some states in Australia where you can see that the macroeconomic data shows that they're recovering better than other parts of Australia. Our judgment was that if we were to try and develop a criteria, or our judgment is, and it remains, that if we were to develop a criteria that included a measure of the profitability of the business or linked payments to things like payments of dividends or payments of bonuses, that would significantly increase the complexity of the program. And when we look across other countries that have implemented similar programs to Australia, there are a large number of programs, like the one in the UK, in Canada, and New Zealand, where Singapore, not New Zealand, where there's no link at all to bonuses or dividends. There are other programs where the government has provided guidance that they don't expect businesses to pay dividends or bonuses while they're eligible for this sort of support, but there's no way in which that's enforced, and that's the case in France, for example. So this is a complicated area. I completely agree that if this was an ongoing program, then thinking about how you might want to deal with this sort of an issue would make sense. But for a time-limited program, I guess our judgment was that the benefit of allowing businesses to know that they would be eligible for the full first 6 months of the scheme, rather than having a complicated process of reassessing their eligibility, say, on a month-by-month basis through those 6 months. That was a trade-off that was actively considered and was decided not to.
Ms Wilkinson, I'm just mindful of time. Thank you. Look, I'm not being critical of your approach to this going into the pandemic, but we have learnt a few things as we walked our way through this. We now have a JobKeeper 2.0. Are you in a position to assure me that we won't see the same unethical behaviour, and that's the kindest word I can use, where companies take taxpayers' money in circumstances where they are purportedly distressed and then pay that to their investors? It's a funneling of taxpayers' money from their pockets into the pockets of investors and into the pockets of CEOs. Moving forward, are you confident that this will not happen?
So I can't assure you of that, Senator. What I'm confident of is that businesses who will be eligible in the September quarter are businesses who still, sorry, not the September quarter, in the December quarter, are businesses that have to have suffered a decline in turnover of 30% in the September quarter. That is a substantial decline in profitability for almost all businesses. So the government certainly expects that the amount of eligibility for the program will be tightened significantly, and it should be the case that the businesses that are in an ongoing sense eligible will be in a much there's going to be a much higher proportion of businesses that have clearly demonstrated their distress in terms of their September quarter outcomes. There isn't anything in the program which has been modified to link payments to dividends or bonuses. There haven't been any modifications of that nature have been taken, but as you said, it is a much...
Why not, Ms Wilkinson?
Why
not? This is offensive to people, really offensive to people. And look, I suspect you're sympathetic to that view. You are driving the policy. How do you stop this offensive behaviour? And I'm not suggesting any company has broken laws. I'm suggesting we have broken laws. And it is Treasury and it is the government, obviously with the consent of the Parliament, that passes laws and places constraints around the abuse that is occurring with these companies. Totally unethical conduct, and in effect, you're indicating here that Treasury's kind of okay with it because for the greater good, perhaps it's too hard to implement something. I think that's unacceptable.
So I guess what I would say is that it obviously has been a matter that for the government and for the Parliament to decide how to design the program. Modifying the eligibility criteria in a way that sought to regulate financial decisions of recipients, I think would be very difficult, partly just because of the fungible nature of money. So businesses, to the extent that was a provision put in, businesses could just choose to defer the payment of dividends, for example, or they can do other things to get around it. We would always be alive to that sort of behaviour. It is absolutely the case that there's no business is required to receive the JobKeeper payment, and on the ethical side, we certainly have had a number of businesses who have chosen not to apply for and receive the JobKeeper payment once their conditions have improved. We've seen that sort of behaviour in the program, and I certainly concur with the statements that were made by Jennifer Westacott on Insiders a couple of weeks ago, which is that this is a matter for businesses to think very carefully about.
Senator Patrick, I'm going to let you go back to your other committee now. You've had more than time, and I've got a long list of people trying to get the call this morning. Thank you. You need to go to your other hearing. Senator Watt.
Stick around until after the ATO.
Okay, sure. Oh, fine. You're welcome. Senator Watt.
Thanks, Chair. I might just pick up where Senator Patrick has left off. So, Ms Wilkinson, I was having a bit of a look at JobKeeper and the fact sheets, and one of the fact sheets about JobKeeper says that its purpose is that it is designed to help businesses affected by coronavirus to cover the cost of their employees' wages so that more employees can retain their job and continue to earn an income. So it's fair to say then that the payment of executive bonuses is not one of the purposes of JobKeeper.
Correct.
And it's fair to say that the payment of company dividends is not one of the purposes of JobKeeper.
It's not one of the purposes, no.
It's all about helping businesses pay their employees' wages.
I just missed that, Senator Watt.
JobKeeper is all about helping employers pay their employees' wages.
JobKeeper was designed to maintain relationships between employers and employees, absolutely, and to assist businesses through these difficult times, maintain those relationships either through payments if employees are stood down, or by offsetting the cost of the wages of those employees.
Okay, so it does go against the purposes of JobKeeper that these funds are being used by some businesses to pay bonuses or dividends?
So I think I'd put it the other way, which say it was not, as you said, as you put your question to me, it was not a purpose of the JobKeeper program.
Okay, and it actually goes against the purposes of JobKeeper for businesses to use JobKeeper funds in this way.
The JobKeeper funds were provided to businesses. The requirement was that businesses had to pay eligible JobKeeper employees $1,500 per person. That's what the requirement of the program was. There weren't any other requirements that were placed on eligible businesses through the program. Okay,
I've heard what you've said about your judgment being that for a time-limited program, it's, my words, not really worth making changes to JobKeeper to address this problem. Has Treasury ever conducted any work for government about how JobKeeper could be changed to eliminate this problem?
I don't think I'd put it as crudely as that it wasn't worthwhile. I think I also made the point that it does seem to us that it's very difficult, given the fungibility of money, to work out how you would effectively impose some sort of a requirement which would be effective and which wouldn't just be able to be avoided by businesses.
Have ministers asked Treasury to undertake any work as to how this problem of businesses using JobKeeper for bonuses and dividends could be addressed?
You know, this discussion has come up, including in this committee before, and obviously we've worked through, and the response to one of the questions on notice, as I recall from the last committee meeting, works through quite a lot of this detail. So that advice has been provided to government about
Treasury has provided advice to government about how we could stop businesses using JobKeeper to pay bonuses or dividends.
I think I would put it that Treasury has provided advice to governments about the challenges around this issue in the context of the questions that have come up, including through this committee.
Okay, so does that mean then that it's been a decision of government or ministers to not act on this issue and not change JobKeeper so that businesses can't use it for bonuses and dividends?
So the design, I mean, the program is like any programs, the design of the program is a matter that is the decision of government. It's not a decision that Treasury can take one way or the other about how to design a program.
So Treasury has provided advice to government about how this issue could be dealt with, businesses using JobKeeper for dividends and bonuses, but government or ministers have made the decision that this is not something to be explored.
So again, I'll have to take on notice exactly what advice has been provided, but certainly this is an issue that the issue of, you know, how these sorts of issues might be dealt with or have been dealt with in other schemes, that information has absolutely been has been discussed with government. But I have to take on notice, Senator, the specific questions about advice that's been provided.
Okay. Can I just go back to the question of the tax cuts, the legislated tax cuts? And can you just remind me of what the estimated cost of each of stage 2 and stage 3 is?
Just hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Senator. So I'm just making sure I've got the right table in front of me. So for the tax plan for budget currently legislated as outlined in Budget 1920, from 1819 to 2021, the increase in the low and middle income tax offset was going to cost $14.75 billion from 1920 to 22-23, and from 22-23, the increase in the low income tax offset threshold from 41,000 to 45,000 was scheduled to cost $4.8 billion from 1920 to 22-23.
So stage 2 in total across the forward estimates is what?
Sorry, Senator, I don't have the breakdown quite in that way. I'll have to take that on notice. I don't know if
Okay,
Mr
and you don't
Thompson's
have-
got the breakdown in that form?
I'll keep looking. I don't know.
We'll have a look, Senator. If
Yeah.
it's possible, we'll be able to do it quickly here in the background. We'll just see if we can pull the numbers together.
But it's fair to say that stage 2 and stage 3 are both separately worth tens of billions of dollars. That's the cost.
That's correct. So, Senator, on notice, I understand to Senator Ketter, at Senate estimates and after the last budget, Treasury provided advice that over the medium term, so from 1920 to 29-30, the total cost of the package was $158 billion.
158, so stage 2 and 3 combined, we're looking at about $158 billion.
That's correct, Senator.
Okay. And how, given where we are now, with the economy the way it is, how would those tax cuts be funded? They'll have to be funded through borrowings, won't they?
I mean, Senator, at the budget, an update will be provided on the state of the fiscal circumstances, including the medium-term outlook.
Sure, but I mean, it's no secret that the budget is now in significant deficit. That's not going to change between now and the budget. So it's fair to say that these tax cuts will now have to be funded from borrowings.
So, Senator, I mean, I'm not sure that I'd sort of do mark a sort of a one-to-one correlation with any of these things. I mean, to the extent that the government is running a deficit and needs to borrow to fund the services that it is committed to funding, less the taxes that it's raising, then yes, the government will borrow, has borrowed and will borrow from the market to do that.
So yeah, okay, so putting the budget as a whole together, the government is borrowing money to fund its expenses, which would now include these tax cuts as they come into effect.
It will borrow what is required in order to, to operate. That's right.
Okay, so it will borrow, the government will be borrowing funds so that it can deliver its budget so that it can operate, including deliver these tax cuts.
As the government always does, yep.
Well, not if it's in surplus, I suppose.
Well, the government borrows the funds that it needs to borrow, and if it doesn't need to borrow funds because it's in surplus, then it doesn't. But yes.
Okay, and I remember at the time of the tax cuts debate, various ministers, questions were being asked about how these were going to be funded. We were talking about tax cuts 10 years in advance before, without anyone knowing what the state of the economy would be. And I remember ministers at the time saying that they would be funded through future economic growth. That future economic growth has now had a massive torpedo put through it, hasn't it?
So I think it's clear that the pandemic has resulted in a significant contraction this year. Yep, that is correct. It's significantly changed our economic circumstances.
So the basis for those tax cuts, or the funding source for those tax cuts that we were told, advised by ministers at the time, being future economic growth, no longer exists.
So in the budget, the government will outline, I mean, in the July statement, obviously, the government only outlined what the economic projections are for 1920 and 2021, and the budget will provide the full forward estimates, economic projections, and will also then provide the medium term. And it's certainly our expectation, which is that the economy is going to grow again and grow and recover over the period ahead. So we're certainly not expecting the sort of outcomes that we've had over the last 6 months to continue into the future. That the economy will return to growth.
Yeah, but we're not going to have the same level of growth that we were told by ministers at the time the tax cuts were introduced we could rely on.
So I think we should have this discussion after the budget, once the medium-term projections and the new economic parameters and the new economic forecasts have been released.
Yeah, but I'm very happy to have the conversation again then, but even based on what we already know, we're not looking at the same rate of growth over the medium term. The economy will not be as big over the medium term as what it was when the tax cuts were first introduced.
I think, Senator, it is the case that we have had a level shift in the size of our economy that we didn't anticipate prior to this crisis, certainly. In terms of the rate of growth that we see going forward, there is still obviously a lot of uncertainty around this scenario, but as Ms Wilkinson said, if we're in a position in a year's time or whatever it may be, for example, to have a vaccine, if we're in a position to have successfully suppressed the course of this virus, we see no reason why after that point economic growth cannot return to the kind of rates that we previously envisaged. And there will be a range of factors that could affect the transition to that point and the structural aspects of the economy and the budget. But as Ms Wilkinson said, we're working through those for the longer term projections in the budget. But the rate of growth itself, we don't see any particular reason why, if we are able to successfully contain this virus, why the rate of growth over the longer term cannot return to a strong and sustainable rate.
Okay. Can I just quickly turn to Job Seeker? You probably saw the report that was released by ACOS that was commissioned by Deloitte in the last few days, which flagged a removal of, I think, about $31 billion from the economy as a result of the impending cuts to Job Seeker. One of the other things that hasn't been reported as much from that report was that it was likely that the greatest pain arising from the cuts to Job Seeker would be felt in regional parts of the country, which had higher unemployment heading into COVID than particularly city areas. Are you familiar with that aspect of the report?
So I've seen the high level reporting, Senator, of that report. I'll confess I haven't had a chance yet to dig into it in great detail, but I have seen the high level reporting.
Okay. Well, based on what you know and where unemployment has been high around the country leading into COVID, is it fair to assume that the greatest pain, and that's my word, the greatest number of people suffering a reduction in their job seeker payments will be felt in regional and remote parts of the country?
In the broad, I think that's a reasonably fair statement. I think certainly prior to the crisis, we know that unemployment rates have been relatively higher in some of our regional and rural centres relative to our urban centres over time, and that would still be the case. So to that extent, yes. There are also, I think, and I don't have the specific statistics in front of me, but there are also fairly significant pockets of disadvantage and communities that suffer high levels of unemployment in parts of metropolitan Sydney and Melbourne as well, and particularly in some of the western suburbs. And so those areas would also be affected. It is the case, though, that this crisis has led to substantially higher levels of unemployment in areas that perhaps previously wouldn't have been suffering from those sort of structurally higher levels of unemployment, and so the casualised workforce in some of our major urban centres and so on have also been affected. So I would say that, and without having the specific breakdown of a distribution, which our employment department colleagues would have better access to, of where the particular numbers sit. So in the broad, yes, I think there is clearly in the regional areas there are structural unemployment issues that are not present in some of our key cities, but they are in pockets. But this crisis, I'll just make the point, this crisis has had a very broad effect and led to higher unemployment across a whole range of areas and localities.
Senator Watt,
You mentioned...
final
Sorry,
question.
Yep. Okay. You mentioned that also metropolitan areas with a highly casualised workforce, which have particularly suffered from lockdowns and the other restrictions. So it would be fair to expect that those areas will also see the greatest impact in terms of reduction of job seeker payments as well?
Well, in short, yes. I think any areas that have been heavily affected where unemployment has now become higher than previously will obviously have a larger effect than those that have not. And I don't, again, have in front of me the breakdown specifically of sector by sector and region by region, but I think those areas that started the crisis from an area of disadvantage obviously have higher unemployment rates than some of the other areas. And then the industries and sectors that have been most heavily affected by the crisis, which you know are in the services sector, tourism sector, accommodation, cafes, food. People exposed to those sectors and regions exposed to those sectors will have a higher preponderance of unemployment than others.
And of course, those casualised areas were largely, or saw many people excluded from receiving JobKeeper as well.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily...
Because of the excluded casuals with less than 12 months service.
Well, I think certainly I'm talking about areas such as hospitality, where I think there has been substantial support provided through JobKeeper to some of those areas, restaurants, cafes, hospitality, etc.
Thank you, Senator Watt. I will have to leave it there. Senator Stoker, we'll go to you, and if you could be as brief as you could, thanks.
I absolutely will, Madam Chair. Thank you. How much is the Queensland border closure costing the national economy?
Senator, I believe earlier in response to a question from Senator Davies, I talked about our analysis, our thinking around the border closures. We don't have a specific dollar amount that we can attribute to the Queensland border closures. To very briefly recap, I suppose the key message from earlier, there is no doubt that the level of interstate trade, particularly in services, particularly in tourism, which I gave a figure that, according to tourism, one of our tourism research bodies, there was around, on average, $45 billion in a normal year of spending on interstate tourism. Clearly, the border closure is preventing much of that activity from occurring, and some of that will be redirected, and obviously, given the income shock that we've seen, some of that would not be occurring now anyway, but that gives you an indication of the size of this effect, and clearly the Queensland market is very heavily exposed to the tourism sector. So the way I would describe it is that there is $45 billion of tourism activity, according to that analysis, that is, I suppose, at risk due to the border closures overall. And Queensland, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Queensland would be a significant share of that regular activity. But we have not done, and other services would also be affected, but we haven't got a specific dollar value that we can attribute to the Queensland border closure.
A related question, has Treasury done any modelling of what the impact would have been on Queensland's economy had the Premier adopted the Chief Medical Officer's advice of adopting protocols for tracing, testing and outbreak containment rather than border closures to allow for greater economic activity and personal freedom?
No, we haven't, Senator. But if it was possible to, clearly if a share of that tourism activity had been able to take place under that model, then that would have obviously led to a stronger economic outcome for Queensland, but we have not quantified that effect.
The government has extended regulatory relief for financially distressed businesses, including temporary relief for directors from personal liability for trading while insolvent. What is the anticipated economic impact of this measure for employees and employers?
So, Senator, unfortunately, we don't have anyone here from Markets Group who are responsible for that particular initiative. So can we take your question on notice and get back to you with an answer?
Please do, that'd be great. Can I go to another matter then? My understanding is that when COVID-19 hit, Australians quite understandably pulled back from signing contracts for new home builds and major rebuilds. Can you explain the impact that the pandemic has had on construction activity from March and any impact that home builder has had in stabilising the sector and supporting the jobs of the people in it?
Thank you, Senator. I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Power, to speak to that.
Thank you, Senator. So I guess at a high level, the home builder scheme, of course, injects a lot of activity into the sector, both from the federal government level, but we know there's also a number of state schemes which are supporting or in fact building on the subsidy that the Commonwealth's providing. Obviously, that scheme is in its early stages and we're starting to see some levels of applications coming through. Certainly, anecdotally, I can tell you the feedback that we're receiving from industry and others is that the support and activity is quite strong in terms of both inquiries and the early interest in that scheme. That is starting to flow through, obviously, into applications, and then it will flow through into approvals. Effectively, I guess we're continuing to monitor that so that we can track that over time. But I would say from a macro perspective, it's the interest has been quite strong and it's supporting quite a lot of activity and confidence in the sector, which I'd say is an important aspect to what's going on there.
And I have, Senator, a couple of figures in front of me, which is the HIA New Home Sales Index, which is one of the indicators we track in this space. We look at a number of indicators, including building approvals and commencements and home sales. But just eyeballing the chart in front of me, it was clear that in the early stages of the crisis that new home sales had dropped substantially and were sitting, instead of probably an average over the last, say, year, at around 4,500 new home sales a month. It had dropped to probably around sort of under 4,000, closer to 3,500, I would say. And then from June, July and August, in those 3 months, there's been a substantial, HIA notes, there's been a very substantial pickup to closer to around 6,000 new home sales per month, and they've certainly attributed part of that effect to the home builder scheme as well as other state schemes.
I've seen some commentary that claims that Treasury modelled the employment which might be generated by the home builder program. Can you clarify for us, did Treasury generate employment modelling for home builder?
What we've modelled, Senator, is and presented in the July update is effectively the stimulus funding across all measures. We haven't specifically modelled employment impacts that relate particularly to home builder. So what we have provided is some information that was requested through this committee about what sort of relationships exist on average. The times now are obviously quite unique in the sense that confidence is really important and at a premium, and so some of those relationships probably don't apply in their normal circumstance, I would say, right now, but we haven't done specific modelling of employment impacts of this specific measure in absence of the others, if you like, because there's some obviously important interaction effects that go on across a whole bunch of stimulus measures in the economy at the moment.
I understand Treasury's previously used a jobs multiplier when it comes to construction and related industries. Given the deterioration of the market due to the COVID-19 pandemic, is this an accurate guide at present, or is this going to underestimate the likely effect of home builder given present conditions?
So I think we covered this a little bit in our response to, on those to the committee. Essentially, I think given the current conditions, what we'd say is average multipliers would tend to underestimate, partly one because of that important confidence effect that comes into the sector due to the stimulus that's going in, but also, if you like, if you use sort of simple input-output effects, they don't tend to take into account second round effects, which, and once you support wages and that continues to support consumption through the economy. And so, for example, it doesn't take into account those effects. So I think we would, on average, to say, given where the economy's at the moment, those relationships would tend to underestimate those employment impacts.
A pretty important part of the COVID-19 support for the construction industry. But what other support exists for people who are in those construction jobs, and how does that compare to other sectors?
Talk about multitasking, Senator Stoker. You're doing very well. We're all in admiration here and welcoming our new committee members to the table as well.
We're adapting.
Yeah,
We're adapting.
and speedy questions. And then the mute button. But the girls are most welcome, of course.
So in addition to Home Builder, the construction or workers in the construction industry are getting a very significant amount of assistance through the JobKeeper program, both sole traders in the construction industry and then also employees of construction businesses. They're very well represented in the JobKeeper program. I don't think I have the details of exactly how much support has gone to employees in the construction industry, but very happy to provide that to you on notice.
And I think the supporting apprentices
Very much.
Oh, of course.
program.
Sorry, there's also, yes, my colleague just reminded me, there's also the Supporting Apprentices and Trainees program, which again provides a significant amount of support to apprentices and trainees in the construction industry. Oh, and sorry, and the third one, sorry to do a reportage, is that businesses in the construction industry are also a significant recipient of the cash flow boost grants, which were targeted to small businesses, and of course construction businesses are well represented amongst small businesses.
Senator Stoker, do you have a final question? Because you've had 10 minutes.
You've been very generous with me, Madam Chair. Look, we had some questions from Senator Davey a little bit earlier about the industrial relations flexibility that has been implemented. Look at this, I'm getting a massage. Check it out.
We're very impressed, Senator, we're very impressed.
We all want one.
There is some upside to this. We have talked about the industrial relations flexibility that's been built in as part of the emergency measures, including JobKeeper.
Yep.
Are you able to quantify the impact that those measures have had on employment rates? And are you able to say anything about what such measures being a part of the long-term landscape would have on the ability of Australians to get jobs as we recover from the pandemic?
So, Senator, we didn't, and I don't think we would be able to quantify what the impact of the JobKeeper direction itself would have had on employment outcomes. But as I said, we've just had a lot of feedback through the business liaison unit about, and this including through the process of doing the JobKeeper review, about the value that businesses placed on those flexibility mechanisms in these circumstances. It's always difficult to model what the impact of these sorts of flexibility measures is. I mean, you normally have to draw upon, I don't know, international studies which kind of compare different systems, and so it's hard to actually then translate these to the Australian context. So I think my overall answer is no, we can't quantify it for you, but I think that they were certainly extremely important in this time, and I think that, you know, some of the discussions which are taking place in the different industrial relations working groups are going to this question about the degree of flexibility which benefits both businesses and employees in the system.
Senator, just to add one last point to that, I believe we discussed in a previous committee hearing, there was some reasonably detailed survey work done as well by the Attorney General's Department on the take-up of these measures. And I think we talked through some of the preliminary results of that at one of the earlier hearings, I believe, and we can make that available again. But it certainly showed that there was a very significant usage of those measures across a number of businesses, and the survey indicated that it had certainly had a material impact on their ability to keep employers connected with the workforce.
Thank you, Mr Yeaman. Thank you, Senator
Encouraging.
Stoker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm
And
grateful.
thank you to your girls for their appearance too. Senator McKim, can you take us out till 12:10?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I can, but I'm going to, if it's okay with you, just offer Senator Seward an opportunity before we get to 12:10.
Oh, yeah, shit.
'Cause I know
Okay.
we've got
Yep.
a couple of questions.
No worries.
So I'll just be very brief. Thank you. I'll just be very brief. I wanted to ask some questions about company profits. So the June national accounts showed a pretty large spike in company profits. So companies are receiving the highest share of income since World War II. Conversely, working people are receiving the lowest share of national income since the 1950s. Why are company profits soaring in the middle of a recession, and isn't that highly concerning?
Thank you, Senator. It certainly is an interesting aspect of the data that we looked at, and I can understand certainly why it's drawn attention from a number of people through the community, because it is a sort of counterintuitive result in the data. I'll make a couple of comments, and my colleague, Mr Power, may like to add. So on the one hand, the way I would describe there's been, as you know, a very, very significant amount of support provided through the households and businesses in a very short space of time into the economy. And so mechanically, in terms of the way the national accounts work, that money needs to go somewhere into the economy in the short term. And clearly at a time where we have restrictions in place, there are a lack of opportunities essentially for households, even if they have the income to go out and to spend or to travel or to distribute that money through the economy. The same applies to businesses in the sense that there's less investment opportunities. There is a level of uncertainty in the economy that suggests that they will delay and hold off on some of those, even the regular maintenance and routine investments that might take place in a business would be reduced. So there is a large amount of money flowing into the economy, largely from the government. Clearly revenue is down. We can see across businesses that in aggregate the revenue side of the equation is not holding up well. But equally, the expenses have come down quite significantly because many of them are either shut down or are running at very reduced capacity and with less staff, less electricity, less rent costs, etc. Some of them have mortgage deferrals as well. So there's a series of expenses that have been reduced, and the way that is mechanically flowing through to the national accounts is through higher profits. Now, we would certainly expect to see over the next few quarters that would then start to flow as the economy starts to recover. As expenses come back up, we would expect to see some of that income that's come through government flow back out through to the rest of the economy over time and provide that floor under activity that I described earlier. On the issue of in many ways it's analogous to analogous to the situation that we see in the household savings rate as well, where money has essentially gone into households in aggregate and it is sort of sat there for now, but it will then distribute out over the economy over the next few quarters. On the issue of the shares, the one point I would make, and my colleague may add to this, is that the way that the ABS captures the household income share, that is measuring the if you like, the wage bill, the compensation of employees primarily for households. There is a substantial amount of household benefit payments, which is, as you know, where most of the income is flowing through on the household side, which is not captured in the household income share that has been widely reported and shown. So if you adjust that share for that additional income that's flowing from government directly into household benefits and payments, it is not as stark as otherwise indicated. But I would say I think we see this as a transitory effect. I agree it's counterintuitive. But in some ways the money has to go somewhere. It's gone onto household balance sheets, it's gone onto business balance sheets in the form of profit, and it will then distribute through the economy over the next 2 to 3 quarters. But I'm not sure if there's any...
All right, thanks for that. I guess time will tell in terms of whether that prediction will come to pass. Can I ask though, will a bigger share of income going to company profits and less to wages growth, will that dampen any economic recovery, and is the government seeking to reverse this trend?
I think so. A couple of things. One is that a lot of the support that's gone through onto the business balance sheets and the way the ABS has accounted for this it's doing two things. Partly it's there to ensure that businesses can actually survive and stay open through this period. So I think in that regard, if we hadn't seen the substantial amount of business support that we have, including through JobKeeper, but also through the cash flow boost and so on, I think we would have seen a much larger number of businesses shut their doors during this period, and that would have flowed directly through to household, to wages and through to sort of the more, as we discussed earlier, that higher income, the lower income spending, but the higher channels of transmission, I suppose, is the way to put it. So I think it's been very important in that regard to keep businesses open and keep confidence that they can maintain their operations. And also, I think mechanically the way that the ABS accounts for it, remembering that JobKeeper is essentially a wage subsidy to businesses, some of the effects, again, that are flowing into what is classified as business profits are actually measures that are designed to support not just business but also to support workers.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Chair. I'll cede the rest of my time
Okay,
to Senator
thank you. Senator Seward.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to go back to the issue of the Deloitte's report, but also the report that shows that about 740,000 people are going to be dropped below the poverty line with the cuts to the coronavirus supplement. Have you briefed the government? I was a bit unclear from the answer to Senator Watt. Have you briefed the government on those two reports? Have you looked at them and briefed the government on them?
Not to my knowledge, Senator.
We certainly have looked. We're certainly aware. We're aware of the reports. Not to my knowledge, we haven't yet briefed government on the findings. No.
Have you reviewed? You're aware of them. Have you reviewed either of them?
So again, there are different parts of Treasury that may or may not have. I have not, Senator, had an opportunity to look at either of those reports.
No, we haven't. We're aware of their existence, but we haven't reviewed them or briefed on them.
So why would you not do that, given that it says that 740,000 people will be dropped below the poverty line in one, and the other says that up to $31.3 billion will be lost from the economy as a result of those cuts, which could also lead to, of course, people being unemployed because of those cuts to the economy. I would have thought that this was a very significant finding that you would have a look at and brief government on.
So, Senator, I'm certainly the Deloitte report, as I understand it, was released earlier this week, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
This week,
I'm sorry, Senator. It's just a question. We're finalising the budget, and there's a lot of work involved around that. We will, of course, look at that report, and we would, as a matter of course, brief the government on any major report like that comes out. I'm less aware of the other report from the ANU that was released, which wasn't released this week, as I understand it.
Several weeks ago.
It was a few weeks ago.
Several weeks ago.
So that one, that one we just haven't turned our minds to. But again, we certainly, we do try wherever we can to look at these reports, which are done by credible, independent analysts, and try and make sure that we understand what the conclusions of those reports are, what drives the results, and we typically do brief the government on these reports when they come out.
So had you done any of this type of analysis that Deloitte has done about the impact of taking that level of support for those on low incomes and unemployed out of the economy? Had you done any similar sorts of modelling or analysis?
So again, we addressed this earlier on in the hearing this morning, where we talked about the fact that as part of the process of updating our economic parameters, we take into account all of the policy settings, including the impact of changes in policy settings going forward. So without necessarily breaking it down to the impact of every individual measure. So we typically look at a whole of economy, from a whole of economy perspective, look at the impact of the suite of government spending decisions and revenue raising decisions, and decompose that, because different spendings, have different targets and they have different multipliers and they have different, there are different groups in the community that have different propensities to consume. So we look at all of that information as part of the process of developing the macroeconomic forecasts, which are then used in things like the budget process.
So the specific, sorry, I'll make it very specific then. Did you look at the impact of the cuts of taking $300 per fortnight off people that are currently on the job seeker and youth allowance payments? That specific measure, because I understand what you've said about the macroeconomics. I'm talking about the impact on people's day-to-day existence. Did you look at that and did you provide advice to government on it?
So as I've said, we haven't provided advice to government on the Deloitte report. We have provided advice to government. We have provided advice to government over the course of this whole pandemic around different payments and different payment levels in JobKeeper and JobSeeker and everything. So we've provided a range of advice like that. In terms of quantifying the impacts, we look at the impacts from a macro perspective, and the policy settings are incorporated in the estimates that we provide.
Senator Sue Whitlock, if you have a... Okay, yep. Final question.
So the answer to that is no, you didn't look at the specific impact that it would have on the economy or on people's lives, is what I take from what you just said.
No, we have included the impact on the economy. We have incorporated that, but we don't break it.
$31.3 billion.
We don't break down these estimates on a measure-by-measure basis. I think that's probably the best way of characterising the way in which we think about what the economic impacts of a package of measures is.
Senator Seward.
You had no understanding of the impact on individuals who were existing on JobSeeker that those cuts would have, both on those individuals and that specific measure on the economy.
I'm not sure that I can go any further than what I've already answered.
Senator Seward, we will have to leave it there. We'll have to resume that, I think, at budget estimates for a longer discussion. Can I thank very much the Department of Treasury for appearing today and remind you where there have been questions taken on notice that we do have a 10-day turnaround, acknowledging that, of course, we understand how pressed things are with putting a budget together, but happy for you to work with us if that is unreasonable. The committee will just suspend briefly, colleagues, until 1:15, just to allow everyone to go and get a drink of water or whatever they need to do before the tax office appear at 12:15. Thank you. The hearing will now resume into the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I welcome officers of the ATO, Mr Jordan, and other accompanying staff. Mr Jordan, I understand you do have an opening statement for us today, which has been circulated and can be agreed by committee members for publication. Would you like to provide that opening statement now? We seem to have lost you from my screen. Sorry, colleagues, stand by. We're just waiting for witnesses to reappear. They've been there for the last 10 minutes or so. Are you right? There's only an hour. There's only an hour, and I've got everybody.
I personally don't have much, so I'll see with Amanda.
Can you just talk to her and just say, look, if it's fine, can I just, give the call to non-government people? Or be very succinct, because I think we'll all have to be. They're back. Commissioner, you're back. Commissioner and team. Hopefully you can hear us. It's the other key ingredient of this experience is vision and sound. We're not having much luck with the second part.
Can you see and hear?
Oh, we can. Perfect. Yes, it's all the stars have aligned. Thank goodness. Commissioner, you haven't disappointed us.
I was saying to Jeremy, I'm glad I'm in his office, not mine, because I can, attribute blame to him if anything goes wrong. But there we are.
Well, you've got your black screens up, so it's very hard to see what's going on in your office, Mr. Hersham.
I know. This is to black
the mystery
out
of the tax office.
Well, no, the westerly view. And my view is Unions New South Wales is a building. There's a big sign just there. So
a reminder of the power of workers. That's good to know.
I know. There you go. But I've never done this black bit before, so is that okay?
Yeah, no, you're all looking good. It's really showing you and your team off, I think.
Oh, well,
there's nothing else to look at.
I look at this black thing. I walked in and I went, what's this all about?
Well, you might be setting a trend. We'll see. We'll see if it takes off.
All right.
Commissioner, we only have an hour with you, so we've got your opening statement. Would you like to present that now?
Thank you, Chair, and I acknowledge we only have an hour, so I will be brief, but I just wanted to commence, our discussion today with, some assurance in my role as Commissioner on the integrity of our compliance approach in relation to the government stimulus measures that we at the ATO are delivering. As you know, it's very different for us to be giving money to people rather than collecting. But we've been hard at work over the last 8 months to ensure that we're getting the right support to the right people. Yet, with many Australians, especially those in Victoria, still struggling, we understand that there is still more work to be done. And with the JobKeeper extension taking effect from 28 September, our role supporting Australians will be extended to March next year. Now, firstly and importantly, the system that we're implementing was designed to make it easy for people to apply and allow payments to be made quickly, and to exclude those who might try to take advantage of the system. On the whole, as I would say, as a general proposition, Australians do take their tax obligations seriously and honestly. So from our preliminary analysis across each of the measures, I can confirm that the vast majority of Australians have done the right thing and only claimed the amounts they were entitled to. That said, JobKeeper, early release of super, and cash flow boost, which I must say hasn't had as much publicity as it probably should have, are all completely new schemes, and we always expected that some people might make honest mistakes despite trying to do the right thing, as well as people at the other end of the spectrum dishonestly trying to rip off the system.
Commissioner, just conscious of the time, are there particular ones you can just points you want to refer to? I don't mean to be impolite to cut you off. It's just
no. I just wanted to make sure that you understand we are doing things.
Yep.
There are some serious financial crimes, fraudulent activities that we're working with the Australian Federal Police to deal with.
Yep.
We have stopped a whole bunch of, applications that just weren't right. So look, I mean, most of what I was saying, I presume that will go on the record.
Yes, it will.
Was some of the media was like, we're not doing anything. Well, of course we are. We're doing a whole bunch of things. We're the tax office, and that. So I'll leave it at that, if you like.
Thank you,
But just to make sure that people understand we are dealing with people at one end who are just ripping off the system and people at the other end who are just making mistakes. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'm sure that many of those issues are ones that senators want to ask questions on, so you'll have the opportunity to answer then. Can I go to you, Senator Watt? We are going to have to do a shortened version of everything if we're trying to get around everybody, so I thank people in advance for their cooperation. Senator Watt, I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Chair. And Commissioner, can we just start with what you've just been talking about around compliance? So obviously this has really come to light through an article in the Sydney Morning Herald a few days ago. Is it the case that the tax office has received about 8,000 tip-offs around potential misuse of this JobKeeper scheme?
Yes, so Senator Jeremy Hirschhorn, Second Commissioner, Client Engagement Group. So Senator, we have now received about 9,000 tip-offs.
Okay, and according to this article, about 2,200 employees had been found to be on multiple applications for payments. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator. So can I maybe give a little bit of context? So tip-offs are, of course, so we pour, so 55,000 applications. So to just give a sense of the size, 55,000 applications for JobKeeper were stopped in the system before an application was even made. We have done about 75,000 compliance actions in the course of JobKeeper. Tip-offs are one source of compliance action. One of the issues which you're now pointing to is employees who are in multiple forms. And yes, there have been about 2,000, a bit over 2,000, 2,200 employees that we have identified as being in multiple forms. Of course, that's very easy for us because you have to put in a tax file number, a valid tax file number to apply for JobKeeper. So that is one of our simplest data matching exercises.
Okay, so just, I mean, the crux of this article is that despite all of the tip-offs and other methods, there has not yet been a single fine or penalty issued for the misuse of JobKeeper. Is that correct?
So, Senator, yeah, so can I say there's a very important word there, which is yet. So there's a full spectrum. So we have done a lot of activities chopping people off from JobKeeper on a prospective basis. We've had a range of activity clawing back JobKeeper from people where they've claimed it inappropriately. We have a number of matters where we are looking to impose penalties, but you can appreciate that we have significant safeguards before we issue penalties on people. And then at the other end of the spectrum, as the Commissioner referred to, we have a smaller number of matters which are going to the police and via the Serious Financial Crimes Task Force.
Do you know how many have
you've
been?
got to realise, if I could just jump in, I mean, we can't just go putting on penalties to people. We've got to look at intent, right? Because if there is intent to deliberately misuse the system, that's a fine, right? If the intent is not that, but just a misunderstanding, well, we're not going to fine people. So that takes a bit of time. It's a serious thing to impose a penalty on people. So we need to understand the
Obviously
intent.
a serious thing if businesses are misusing taxpayers' funds though as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Senator, if I just make one sort of additional comment, that in many of these cases, even where the claim is incorrect, the money has been passed on by the employer to the employee. So the employer has not financially benefited from the mistake because they have passed on the money. And so, of course, that also goes into our consideration as to how we treat that incorrect claim.
Okay. Have you, are there instances that you're aware of employees not being paid penalty rates that they are entitled to because JobKeeper is being used to pay a flat rate and less tax than normal?
Yes, so Senator, of course, under JobKeeper and the elements that we administer, in order to pay JobKeeper, in order to be eligible to receive a JobKeeper reimbursement, the employer has to pay their employee $1,500. On the other side of the coin is the fair work obligations. And indeed, you know, what we're concerned is that $1,500 minimum has been paid. Of course, under employment law, you have to be paid for the hours that you work under the agreements that you have. We are aware of some cases where it appears where we have enough information or a tip-off that appears not to be the case. In those cases, we refer the matters to Fair Work, the Fair Work Ombudsman. We have referred about 300 matters to the Fair Work Ombudsman.
All involving penalty rates or a mixture of?
Oh no, just where employment conditions, let's say normal wage conditions, appear not to have been met.
Okay. And so presumably the Fair Work Ombudsman is working through those? Yes.
Yes, Senator.
Right. In this article, it says that there were more than 15,000 businesses removed from the scheme by the ATO. I don't think you gave us an update on that figure when you were talking just before.
Yes, so Senator, of the 75,000 or so matters that we have done, and in a sense we have tiers of action, we have concluded close to 50,000 matters. And out of that, we have found about 15,000 businesses ineligible and chopped them from the scheme, and about 2,500 employers partially eligible, where they've claimed for some employees validly and some employees not validly.
We were talking with Treasury about the issues regarding some businesses using JobKeeper payments to pay executive bonuses and dividends. is there anything that the ATO can do about that under your existing powers?
Yes, so Senator, what I would say is that the rules for JobKeeper that we administer is really based on a turnover condition. We are obviously very aware that some companies have been paying dividends and executive bonuses whilst in receipt of JobKeeper. That is technically irrelevant to the application of JobKeeper. However, from our perspective, that is a risk factor for us in considering which companies we choose for turnover reviews. So if a company appears to be in buoyant economic health, we will check their turnover calculations, but there is nothing in the rules which we administer which go to bonuses or dividends.
Right. So even though you obviously have a number of businesses under investigation for some form of misusing JobKeeper, the businesses which have apparently used JobKeeper payments to help pay dividends and bonuses, they are not being investigated. That is not a form of misuse of JobKeeper that's being investigated by the ATO.
So Senator, what I would say is the condition of the scheme is that the eligible turnover went down by the relevant percentage for at least one period. As long as companies pay the $1,500 minimum to the relevant employees, that is the end of our task.
Okay. And you haven't provided any advice to government about addressing this issue of using dividends or bonuses, JobKeeper for that purpose?
So Senator, that would be the sort of matter which Treasury is the policy agency in relation to JobKeeper.
Thanks. Obviously, the new JobKeeper scheme with the new payments starts in less than 2 weeks. As I understand it, there are not yet draft rules or guidance to assist businesses with some of the key issues. When's that going to happen by?
So Senator, it's Deborah Jenkins speaking. So though there was a whole lot of public advice and guidance released last night, the rules were signed off by the Treasurer on Tuesday night.
Right.
3 legislative instruments were signed off by the Commissioner yesterday. That was Wednesday, wasn't it? Yes. And so that information is now out there.
Okay, thanks. I hadn't caught up with that, so we'll take a look at those.
Thank you.
Just going back to the potential misuse of JobKeeper, are you aware of any examples of labour hire firms being paid JobKeeper as a result of them transferring workers who they have employed to the books of the host employer where they work, and using that reduction in payments they then receive from the host employer as the basis of their reduction in turnover?
So Senator, offhand, I am not aware of any such investigations. That's not to say that they are not taking place. I would note that the JobKeeper rules have explicit anti-abuse rules aimed at artificial schemes of effectively redeploying people around and manipulating turnover. So if there was a tip-off or we came across such a artifice, we would investigate and have the tools to deal with it.
So prima facie, you'd obviously have to investigate it, but prima facie, if a labour hire firm was, for argument's sake, transferring 30% of their workforce to the host employer's books and used that as the 30% reduction in turnover that they needed to claim JobKeeper, that's not allowed?
So that would be of extreme interest to us, and we would be looking to apply the anti-abuse laws.
Okay. And I take it would be of interest to you as well if there was some arrangement then between the labour hire firm and the host employer about how much the host employer had to be paying for the remaining workforce of the labour hire firm?
Yes, so that sort of arrangement would be of great interest to us.
Okay, we might have a chat about that offline. are there any other issues that you've come across regarding labour hire firms and host employers, not like the one that I've just talked about?
So, Senator, I can't think of any. I might refer to my colleague, Mr O'Halloran, who's Deputy Commissioner in charge of economic stimulus, to see if he has any examples.
James O'Halloran, Deputy Commissioner, JobKeeper. In short, specifically, the answer is no, but I would say that obviously in checking the range of eligibility criteria, whether it be from the tip-offs or whether it be from our own sources of changes to company structures and arrangements that we become aware of, certainly those reviews are taking place, but specifically no.
Okay, thanks. Can I just take you to one specific example in Queensland that you may be aware of? That a large meatworks near Ipswich, JBS, have just unfortunately had to lay off 600 of their workers. And my understanding of their situation is that they have suffered a pretty dramatic turnover decrease, but haven't hit the 50% mark because they're part of an overall holding company. The local member there, Mr. Newman, Shane Newman, has written to the Treasurer seeking a reconsideration of that. Has that been considered by the ATO?
So, Senator, we can't talk about individual cases, so I will talk as much as I can generically. That yes, for very large businesses, so businesses with more than, I think, $1 billion turnover, there is an enhanced turnover reduction test. It's a 50% reduction, not a 30% reduction. So that is the rule which applies to very large businesses.
Okay, thanks for that. And just finally, I'm aware that there are a number of political parties and their branches who have been able to obtain JobKeeper on the basis of meeting the turnover test. Haven't got an issue with that. But if it were the case that a political party was receiving JobKeeper and diverting those funds to campaign activities, that would also not be permitted under the JobKeeper rules, am I right?
So, Senator, I'm aware of some of the recent press activity, but I'll again speak generically, that what matters is that the employee receives at least $1,500 per fortnight. What we do find in practice is that and this is actually a reasonable percentage of our tip-offs about wage conditions, is that an employee misunderstands JobKeeper and believes that they should receive $1,500 in addition to their ordinary pay. Whereas the requirement under the rules is that they receive $1,500 for the fortnight. Once they receive $1,500 for the fortnight, again, as long as they're paid the $1,500, in a sense, if you could trace specific money, it doesn't really matter. It's just that they are paid the $1,500 in the fortnight.
But if the money is not being paid to the employee, if the money is being paid to a campaign account, that surely can't be allowed.
Again, so if the employee receives less than $1,500 for the fortnight in salary and wages, they have breached JobKeeper.
I mean, that's the sort of stuff I started to talk about, I mean, if people get the money and don't pay it on, I mean, that's, we're bringing the full force of...
That's illegal. That's illegal, putting it simply.
Yeah.
And what is the penalty for that kind of behaviour again, potentially?
It's 15,000 and 2 years in jail, or look, I'll have to.
But yes, I think the exact is going so. To start off again, there's clawback and potentially clawback of all JobKeeper payments, and then it does go, as the Commissioner alluded to, into criminal, including imprisonment.
Okay, and just to wrap up, you'd be aware that I have referred allegations that have been made along these lines involving the Queensland division of the Greens Party to the ATO. Is that matter now under investigation?
So, Senator, again, treading carefully because I don't talk about individual matters, but we are certainly aware of the referral and we take all referrals very seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watt. Can I go to Senator Davey and then I'll go to you, Senator Seward?
Thank you, and cognizant of time, I will try to be brief. There's just a couple of areas that I do want an update on, the first of which is very early on in the piece with the JobKeeper requirements, I, through this committee, raised concerns about the impact, businesses that had already been impacted by drought and bushfire, and so therefore had already seen a downturn in their turnover and revenue, and they were concerned about meeting the reduction requirements to access JobKeeper. At the time, you explained that you had developed alternative tests that those businesses could apply against. Can you just give us an update of how many businesses, if you are aware, may have used these alternative tests, but also how the alternative tests may now be applied going forward to determine eligibility after the September 28
Senator, I might start off and then pass on to my colleague. So we did develop a range of alternative tests, particularly aimed at those sorts of circumstances. In round one, we did not have time to design our digital forms to ask the question as to which alternative test people used or whether they used an alternative test. So unfortunately, I don't have the information to answer your question as to how many accessed it. All I can say is that it seems from the lack of complaints that those tests seem to hit the mark for most potential applicants.
So if people couldn't, sorry, just to cut in there for a second, if people couldn't click on the digital form, how did they apply for an alternative test if it wasn't through the digital form?
Yeah. So, Senator, maybe if I could just clarify, when people self-assessed as to whether they met the relevant decline test, they did not actually need to tell us which test. So nobody needed to tell us whether it was under the usual rules or whether it was under one of the alternative tests. So that's what my colleague was talking about. There wasn't any button to actually say, I chose a different test. Maybe then to answer the next part of your question, and then I'll refer to my colleague, James O'Halloran. There are no changes to the use of alternative tests. So under the extension to JobKeeper, we still have the option. And as you can imagine, Senator, it's to take into account things like people might have had particularly a good year last year. So the relativities look different. And could have been, for example, that they were affected by floods, bushfire, etc., etc. So the option to have an alternative test still actually applies under the JobKeeper extension. James, Mr. O'Halloran, if I might just check with you whether we're actually capturing that information from a systems design perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Two things, if I may, Senator. As said, as it currently is arranged, people, if you like, choose to use the alternative test, but it's not visible to us. But obviously they're obliged to comply with the relevant requirements that suit the circumstances. In JobKeeper 2.0, if I could use that term, we've now had a bit more time to do two things. One is from a user-friendly point of view, so that we can not present unnecessary, choices to people, if you like. Once people indicate that they are going to use an alternative rather than the comparable period and some of those sorts of things, we'll be able to present them with certain information which will allow us to identify that, but also to give them the range of choices under the Commissioner's allied legislative instruments and the like that help them understand what they're doing and also obviously refer them to relevant material. And so we'll have visibility of that, which not only will help us to be able to make sure it's fit for purpose, but also, of course, give us perhaps the ability to answer your question more easily and also to tailor the presentation to people to be able to assist there.
Great, but the important thing is the alternative tests are ongoing and people can still apply under those.
That's correct. That's correct.
Then just a different topic. It's it's the new financial year. Some people are still sorting out their tax from last year and filling in their tax returns. There were some different scenarios applied this year. I'm aware that the tax office enabled people to more easily apply for rebates for working from home, for example. Have the tax office got any additional resources out there for people to help them complete their tax returns in the face of COVID and what the difficulties some people have had? Is there any assistance out there for people?
We've put out a lot of public guidance because of quite a huge difference in working environments. There are certain per hour amounts, and look, there's been a lot of inquiries about, okay, there's that hour amount, but what else can I claim? And we've got a lot of, no great surprise, scripting for our contact centres that try to help people understand what are the additional amounts you can claim. And I could go on forever here, but I won't, about, home offices, electricity, phones, data, and all the rest of it, right? But we've tried to put a whole bunch of stuff out there to help people understand, particularly through the agent. The agent network, tax agents, they still lodge a lot of tax returns for individuals. I don't know whether small business is particularly differently affected here because they probably, did what they did at home and have kept doing it. So it's probably your wage and salary earners that are in a different situation. And we've helped the agents try to give them a lot of guidance.
Yeah. So Senator, maybe just very specifically and very quickly, Chair, I know we often have tax time help guides, so there are people in the community who volunteer to help out people prepare their tax return. This year we've had to do it slightly differently, and we've actually done a lot of that online. I know people have there's been very, very good uptake. This is obviously to make sure that it's COVID safe. Another avenue for people is through the tax clinic program, which is not run by the ATO, but is run through the universities. And they're certainly available to help people as well at this time. So there are a number of other channels, as well as the Commissioner said, we've got a lot of advice and guidance. We've been running a lot of webinars that have been very successful as well.
Yes, and maybe if I could just add one final point, which is a call out to anybody.
We can all have a go here.
Sorry.
But a call out to anybody.
You do want a lunch break, do you? Go on.
We find out that a lot of people get behind in their tax returns and don't know what to do. And really these tax clinics.
Thank you. We know we can't discuss individual tax matters
We don't discuss
at
individual
all,
tax matters.
ever.
But can I say the tax clinics are excellent. Like they're really doing a great service to people who are falling behind, and I really recommend them to your constituents who have fallen behind in their tax matters.
Thank you, Mr. Hersham. Can I go to Senator Seward, please?
Yes, thanks. I wanted to go to some of the issues around compliance and ask about the multiple forms in terms of the answer that you gave on that issue. You said there'd been around between 2,000 and 2,500. Is that employers?
So Senator, that's the number of employees, or let's say number of individuals appearing in a form. So it's not the employer. Some of them might be as employees, some of them might be as eligible business participants, but that's the number of people who appear in two or more claims.
Okay, and what do you do when that happens?
Yes, so we need to investigate that. So we investigate them, and we find there's a range of scenarios that happen. At one end of the spectrum, it is that the employee has filled in forms to multiple employers saying that they are eligible, and the employers are paying it in good faith. In that scenario, generally
How many of those, of that number, how many of those have been in that situation?
So Senator, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take that on notice. I don't have that number in front of me, but it's most.
Okay.
But it takes a while to investigate these things because we've got to be very delicate with multiple employers and privacy and whatnot, but it's most. And so there what we do is we make sure that going forward, only one employer, we work with the parties to have the dominant employer going forward who pays it. And potentially, if the employers have been passing it on in good faith, we don't try to claw it back from the employers, but we might ask the employee to pay one of their job keepers back. At the far end of the spectrum, and this is a very small number, what we have found is people who thought it was a very smart idea to put down their name in multiple employers or in multiple claim forms, often of associated companies. Of course, that's really obvious to us because there's nothing simpler than data matching a tax file number. But we have matters at that end of the spectrum which we are pursuing as fraud prosecution type matters, where people have put themselves down in 10 forms.
Okay, and how many of those claims are that scenario?
Oh, so we're talking single figures in that sort of scenario.
Okay.
And so then we have a range of things in the middle where somebody looks like it. Somebody looks like an eligible employee to an employer, but they haven't done the paperwork properly, or they've misread the paperwork. And so we have there'll be a range of outcomes, and of course we adjust what we do in terms of clawing back or issuing penalties on that spectrum of behaviour.
Okay, and so how many penalties have actually been put in place for that scenario? You said in single figures.
Okay, so on the fraud matters are in single figures. We have currently not yet issued, so the important word is yet, issued any penalties, but we have, and again, it's not many matters, but we're talking maybe, say, 30 matters where we're considering penalties, or we have decided to issue penalties but have not yet issued them.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to the 75,000 compliance actions? What's the predominant issue? Is there a predominant issue there? Actions where you've had that 75,000. What are the prominent causes of the need for that compliance action?
Yes, so Senator, I'll clarify a little bit, and I will make a few comments, and then maybe pass over to Deputy Commissioner O'Halloran. So 75,000 represents the ones where our risk engines or our filters have identified that this is a case that needs a second look, and we pause payment. Okay. So so they're ones we take a second look at. Of those, we have put about 50,000 into full compliance action. So
that's where the 50,000 comes from.
That's where the 50,000 comes from. So we pause 75,000, we then go to the 50,000. And indeed, we've got 50,000 is of those we've completed. There are obviously there are quite a few still in progress.
Of the 75?
Of the 75.
Oh, okay, right, okay.
So where our first wave of activity was focused, which is really out of the systems, was really around eligibility questions.
Yeah.
It's where businesses don't, and one of our sort of phrases is they don't have sufficient signs of life.
Mm.
So some of the really important integrity measures in the system were that you are in the system, you've been lodging returns, you had employees, you'd lodged your tax return, you'd lodged your BAS, where some of those things have not, on our systems, appear not to be the case. We've flagged those, we pull them off to have a good look. We do not assume that our systems are infallible. We'll generally go to the employer and say, look, it doesn't look to us like you're eligible from what we've got on our systems. Some come back to us and say, actually, we've got this extra information. We are eligible and we agree.
Yeah.
Many sort of just go away. But I might go to,
I mean, some people just try it on. They just whack a few things in there, and clearly our systems pick it up, right? And clearly,
how many of those are there?
You know.
Those that are going on.
well, so, and again, it's hard to know whether it's a deliberate malicious try-on or whether it's a misunderstanding or whether it's merely, I'll see if they, you know, I think many Australians would say, even under a self-assessment system, I think they have the attitude that if they put a form into the tax office, it's up to the tax office to work out if they're eligible. So there's a range, again, there's a range, like it's, we can't tell whether it's malicious, in a sense reckless or well-intended, but I might throw over to Deputy Commissioner O'Halloran for a bit more detail there.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Just a couple of things in addition to what's been commented on. The 75,000 is if you'd perhaps in a practical sense say are taken offline for either a one-to-one examination or conversely a group examination because of a characteristic, bearing in mind all of our applications are run through every day, every week, every month, risk filters. So, you know, these are a very small relative percentage in the scheme of things, but they've hit some analytic trigger, if you like. By the nature of the demographics within JobKeeper, clearly a lot of them are perhaps, and signs of life terminology was mentioned before, so what we term for JobKeeper purposes eligible business participants. They may not be in the GST system, they may be, you know, quite small businesses, and quite often there's information that only the employer or the applicant, if you like, would actually have. The nature of the relationship, questions around the employee, questions around the entity, they may not have lodged, so we actually, if I can use the term, we don't know what we don't know, and certainly in the first few months in particular, we were focused on stopping a sensible amount of payments so that we could establish some bona fides. And as soon as that's done, and if I may quickly, you know, we've also gone to the same degree. We give people SMSs when we've stopped it. We tell them if there's a decision that says, you know, if we don't hear from you in 28 days or something, and there's an impact, we send them another SMS, so and often we give them another 14 days. So that's the filter process, and then subsequently going to the question of the range of activities. We've really had 5 sort of filters, broadly speaking. The entity itself, is it eligible, which is the employer, if I could use that term. Are the employees appropriate and eligible and not barred because of some perhaps visa issue or some other related matter? Then there's obviously issues that we might have from our own identification. You know, to be honest, something doesn't look right because of the tolerances or the parameters, or it might be that they look too big to have 100 employees, or they look too small to have, you know, some other variation. And that's why we have a look at those, and then we release the payment. And I just stress the 75,000 and probably another 15 or so that are currently on hand, give or take, 15,000. Clearly these are a mixture of pre-payment and post-payment. Bearing in mind every month at the moment, an applicant makes a declaration. They're making actually a declaration to the Commissioner in terms of the appropriateness, if they're just saying they're still eligible. And sometimes we've received some new information where we might take that offline or at least contact them and say, listen, there's something here that we want a clarification on, if that's adequate, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Seward, do you want to just a couple more minutes, just because...
Yeah, I've only got a couple more, Chair.
Okay.
Where the money, one of the key things is obviously the money going to the employee. How many can I first ask, where that's not happening, that gets dealt with by the ATO, doesn't go to, doesn't get sent off to the
Serious Financial Crimes Task Force.
Oh, no, were you referring to Fair Work?
Oh, Fair Work, sorry.
Yeah, and so Senator, what I would say is if somebody is not passing on the $1,500 to their employee, it is definitely a matter for us. It might also be a matter for Fair Work if they're being underpaid for the hours that they do work, but it's definitely a matter for us, and that's the sort of matter that we take extremely seriously.
Okay. And how many complaints about that have you had?
I might pick.
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
sorry.
Thanks, James.
So a couple of things. I'll try and be succinct, but if you want more, please let me know. In terms of community tip-offs, ones that we've actioned or followed up because we were able to, or at least they look like they were able to be followed up. There's about 300 of those that have come in out of that pre-existing 9,000. I think it's important to note that just because a complaint comes in, and with due respect to the complaint, these risk filters that I mentioned earlier, quite often we've already assessed the risk or the veracity of the claim about right or wrong employees for one important reason. 88% of all employees claimed in JobKeeper are actually reported through single touch payroll. So we have visibility of, as has been mentioned by the Commissioner and others, of was there an entry that, if you like, prima facie is a payment of $1,500, and it's reasonable to assume that that's been passed on. It's not conclusive, but when you're looking at the scale that we've got, and from that process, for 92% of those ones that are reported through JobKeeper, that's one of the prime features that gives us an ability to be confident, unless there's really something in particular that we can follow up that says, well, it looks like there's been a payment that's been passed on. We've probably done about 500 or so quite specific, if you like, wage condition type reviews, but it's pretty common in all of our circumstances to draw from the sorts of information sources that I've touched on. And finally, if I may, Senator, if you look at the earlier figure you referenced in relation to the number of multiple employers and employees, I think that's why that the scale is relatively small, even though it's important to capture. But certainly those are the sort of three bits that we look at to give us a confidence of the ability to prevent it, identify it and action it where we can, noting that in some instances, of course, one needs to be a bit careful from an evidentiary point of view, not to jump to conclusion that the employer or the employee was necessarily mischievous, or conversely that in fact there may be some things that weren't understood and which we've found that in a lot of instances.
So can I just ask one more clarification? An employee that has a complaint that the money hasn't been passed on, do they have to go to the tip-off line if it's about their...
Well, have to is probably a bit strong, Senator, but that's the simplest. That's why we have a dedicated number, the JobKeeper hotline. We obviously have other processes to try and pick up ones that come in. To be clear, most people don't necessarily come in describing it as a wage condition type question. So we're always cautious of trying to pick up what we can, if that makes sense. And similarly, we have referral arrangements between Fair Work and ourselves.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Seward. Just before I go to Senator Lambie, could I just ask if the committee can get a figure of the dollar value of any of the JobKeeper payments that have been recouped to date, and also the number of payments?
So, Senator, I can give you a rough number right now.
Yep.
So, in terms of amounts we have recouped and are in the process of recouping.
Yep.
And that includes both voluntary, let's say maybe, and voluntary has all sorts of connotations perhaps, nudged, encouraged voluntary repayments as well as forced repayments. We're talking about $75 million.
75 million?
Yes, we've clawed back.
And, sorry, can you break that into voluntary versus non-voluntary?
So about, let's say, about 60 million of it is, let's say, it may be encouraged clawback.
Yep.
And 15 is forced.
Okay. And do you know how many individual businesses that relates to?
I'd have to take that on notice, I'm afraid.
Okay, if you could take that on notice. You don't have any other data around the recouping that might be of interest to the committee?
That's the extent of the data I've got with me.
Okay. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr Hersham. Senator Lambie, and then I'll go to Senator Patrick for the final section.
Thank you, Chair. Can you please tell me what's the largest amount that a single employer has received in the JobKeeper payment since March?
James, I'm not sure if you have that information, but unless you have,
to be
might
honest,
have to take that on notice.
Yeah, sorry, Senator, I have to take it on notice. And your question, as you broke up a bit, was, if you like, the largest payment or the largest cumulative payment?
No, well, while you're doing it, maybe you should break it up to the 100s. I don't know because I'm not sure how much you paid out. So maybe we could look at going in the hundreds, thousands. If you could just break it down a bit, you know, how many.
But your question was the cumulative payments, if I could just make sure I understand it. Thank you. I'll have to take it on notice if I may, Senator.
That's fine. I've asked you guys before about enforcing the rules of the early access to super scheme, and you said last time that you were conducting a pilot study using the single touch payroll system to look at whether there were widespread breaches of the rules. How's that pilot study going?
Yes, thanks, Senator. So if I can maybe give an update. We spoke about the context is that for about 92% of cases, we have evidence through STP and other sources that the people are likely to be eligible. We then did our first tier pilot, which we did a very time-limited pilot where we attempted to contact 160 people, of whom we contacted only 71, but 63 were eligible and 8 were not. So of those we contacted, about 90% were eligible, but we didn't contact all of them. That flipped us into a second round pilot where we've focused on 3 high risk pools around tip-offs. There's one of the pools, employees who really looked to us like they had high continued employment, and also some referrals due to through the MyGov process. What I would say across those 3 pools, it appears that on the tip-offs, which is the highest risk category you would think, about half are actually eligible and half are not eligible. Across the high risk employee category, about 70% were eligible and only 30% ineligible. And on the MyGov referrals, pretty much everybody was eligible. So given that they were 3 deliberately chosen high-risk pools, it's telling us that the level of inappropriate access in that 8% uncertain pot is likely to be relatively low, certainly less than half.
That's half of what? Half the people?
Of the 8%. Yeah. So maybe flipping it around the other way, it would appear that, and again, these are only, can I say, this is indicative analysis and early days, but it appears that more than 96% of applicants and maybe closer to 98% are actually eligible.
Okay, has anyone had to, has anyone at all had to pay tax on the money that they claim from their super without actually qualifying for the scheme?
Yes, so I can confirm, Senator, that about 90 odd people have received notice that we have withdrawn our declaration, which means they now have to pay tax on the amounts they've withdrawn from the scheme.
Okay, and what did the pilot study suggest about the number of people who have withdrawn their super without qualifying for the scheme? Was that only the numbers, is it?
So that's the people who have withdrawn money from super without being eligible, based on those indicative analysis, is that it's a small number, like it's a small percentage of applicants. So as I said, most likely probably somewhere between 2 and 4% of applicants.
Okay, so what's the next steps for your broader compliance program?
Yeah, so Senator, we are finishing off our second round pilot, and then off the back of that, we are working out how broadly we roll out our compliance approach. I think it's fair to say that we've been encouraged by the high level of compliance, which will probably mean that and that will be used to inform the intensity of our compliance actions. Obviously, we have constrained resources and we put our resources to the most important compliance issues. and we are currently forming what is our ongoing compliance strategy. I might actually just make one other point, is that one of the things that we have also identified, which is not an eligibility question, but is more a tax planning or a tax avoidance strategy question, is that we have identified about 1,200 people who have withdrawn money from super and then immediately recontributed it. And we have written to them advising them that there's the potential application of the anti-avoidance rules, and they might want to consider their position in their next tax return in terms of claiming a deduction for the recontribution.
And I mean, that's the point. They'd get a tax deduction for the money that they put back in. So, you know, it's like a circle. They take it out and then put it back in, and they end up with a tax deduction, right? So that's not what the intent was.
No. How many did you say that was, Mr. Herschel?
About 1,200, Chair.
1,200.
1,200, 1,200.
And seemingly not organised, or, you know, just individuals?
Well, so everybody's just, in a sense, everybody's just an individual. I don't think we've identified any particular common advisors of that strategy. Albeit, can I say, we were unhelped by the fact that there was a show, I think, on the ABC where they introduced an academic who suggested such a strategy, which was a little bit unhelpful. But we have not at this stage identified any common advisors.
And was there a timing correlation between those two events? I mean, was it something you noticed after that?
So, Senator, I couldn't talk to that. I don't think we've gone to that level of analysis.
Sorry, Senator Lambie, if you have a final question, then I'll go to Senator Patrick. I'm hoping that witnesses could stay with us till about 1:20 or just after. We did start a bit late. That was all once we got our technology problems sorted. Senator Lambie?
Yeah, so just in reference to qualifying for the super scheme, so no one that you're aware of has been fined yet, and at the moment you're still sifting through whether or not how are you going to work this? You're going to give people a warning to put their money back? How's it going?
Yeah, so Senator, we have received some voluntary disclosures, and in those cases we generally take either no action or deem it to be, or to return it to being accessible. On the pilots we have done, we have only made the amounts accessible, so we've withdrawn the declarations. We have not levied penalties. We are more likely to levy penalties where people have got a pre-warning that they're probably not eligible, so that's more likely in round 2. But we have not done so. We have not levied any penalties yet in relation to the early release of super.
Thank you. Senator Lambie, we're really up against it. Can I go to Senator Patrick?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Just very quickly to the Commissioner, how far off are we with the Lend-Lease tax ruling, the final?
So the...
Okay, so...
I didn't hear that.
Yeah, so the Senator is referring to, I think, a draft ruling in relation to the consolidation and tax implications of retirement village liabilities.
Right.
Linking it to our terms of reference, of course.
Well, we're going to need the money, Chair.
Well...
So I might pass over to my colleague. I must admit, I had some...
There was a bit of skewer there when you sort of mentioned that, Elaine. I went, what? You know, I'm not quite sure.
Yes. So it's fair to say that I'm probably more familiar with that draft ruling than perhaps some other draft rulings. Senator, I'd have to take on notice when it is planned to be finalised, but my understanding is soon.
So just to help out, soon, does that mean a week, a month, a couple of months?
Again, I have to take on notice, but I would be very disappointed if it was still outstanding at the end of this calendar year.
Thank you very much. Now, just moving to, and I have been involved in another course, I may have missed some elements of your evidence. Just in relation to some of these companies that have been on JobKeeper but then at the end of it, paying dividends, paying bonuses and so forth. I know you won't want to talk about individual companies, and I'll avoid us having to go there, but is the tax office looking back at those particular companies to make sure they are fully compliant or were indeed fully compliant in respect of their applications?
Yes, so Senator, I did touch on this, but absolutely I will confirm that one of the things that we look at in our JobKeeper compliance is whether the turnover reduction tests have been met. The buoyant economic good health suggested by dividends and executive bonuses is a risk factor that we take into account in determining which companies we should review their turnover calculations.
Okay, and I remember the nice conversation we had back, I think it was in May, where we talked about black and white and grey. In terms of looking back at those applications, are they kind of very black and white, or is there greyness that can be transmitted through the applications? If you felt that there was a cause of concern, would you go back through additional information, look at their financial records, for example, to make sure that people were being, as honest as they possibly could, or as optimistic as they possibly could have been when they made the application?
So Senator, so the first thing, I'll make one comment, which it is absolutely possible to meet the turnover tests and to pay dividends and executive bonuses. So but we are looking at large companies. So we've actually reviewed the turnovers of over 1,000 large companies, their turnover calculations. We have found some, on the whole, can I say on the whole, they meet the turnover test, they've calculated it appropriately, but there are some who have not. I think we're talking in the order of 10 that we have discovered that we think have made errors in their turnover calculations, and we are currently either clawing back, and considering penalty positions in relation to those companies.
Okay.
I think it's one of those things, Senator. I think Jennifer Westacott, the BCA, made some comments recently about, it's a moral issue, rather than a legal issue. As Mr. Hirschon has said, you can meet the turnover reduction, you can meet all the tests, but, if you're taking money from the government, from the community, should you be, paying out bonuses? And that's not our role. But it's for you to, pick that up and
look, I understand
do what you want with it,
sort of thing. There's a difference between an ethical approach and a legal approach, and the fundamental jurisprudence differential is that the second one allows officials to apply a sanction of some sort. And of course, you're quite right. It's companies can have abided by the law. I'm trying to get to the point where we look and say, does the law need to change? Do the regulations need to change to make sure that that we don't have a situation where taxpayers' money, the money that you collect, gets funneled into, ends up getting funneled into dividends and or executive pay pockets?
Okay.
And that's probably a comment, Chair.
Yeah,
so
it is a comment.
thank you.
So as you've run out of questions, Senator Patrick, we'll leave it there. Can I thank the Tax Office very much for appearing today. We really do appreciate your ongoing involvement with the committee and your preparedness to appear. We look forward to talking with you again as the committee continues its inquiry, as I'm sure you do. And the committee will now suspend until 2 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Chair.
Chair.
Thank you, Committee.
Thank you.